Good evening. Tonight's story is not fiction. It is not imagination or rumor. It is a real case, one that unfolded in the ordinary streets of a modern city, yet ended in ways so devastating that it still echoes in courtrooms and in the memories of those who lived through it. This is a story told step by step, detail by detail, for those who remain awake in the quiet hours when the world outside has gone still. If stories like these hold your attention, if you find yourself listening as the rain falls and the night deepens, please subscribe, leave a comment about where you are tuning in from, and share these stories with others who also listen when sleep feels far away. Now, close your curtains, lock the front door, let the hum of the air conditioner fill the room. Pull the blanket over yourself, but leave one foot uncovered. Strange as it sounds, science shows this small detail helps the body cool, which eases the mind into rest. Outside, the rain begins as a faint tapping against the window, then grows into a steady rhythm. That rhythm is our companion tonight, soft enough to comfort, steady enough to remind us that the world moves on, even as we turn to the past. In the city of Bristol, England, a man named Mark sought companionship in the way many do now, through an online dating website. He was 24, Dutch by birth, an engineer who had come to England to work, to build, and perhaps to create a life away from home. He was described by those who knew him as gentle, even reserved, with a smile that made others feel comfortable. He was the kind of man who rarely shared his struggles, who preferred to hold difficulties quietly, who tried to see the best in others, even when it cost him peace. On that website, he met a woman named Berlina. She was older, 37, a South African fashion design student who carried herself with a certain intensity. She had been in Bristol for some time, shaping a life away from her homeland. Both of them shared a diagnosis that carried stigma. They lived with HIV, and for people like them, specialized websites created a rare kind of refuge. In that space, there was no need to explain, no fear of rejection, for something written into their medical records. It was a place where connection could be built on understanding rather than shame. At first, their relationship carried the marks of hope. She admired his stability. He admired her creativity. He was precise and methodical. She was impulsive and passionate. They moved in together, and for 5 years created what looked from the outside like a life in progress. Mark provided financial support, she pursued her studies, and together they formed the image of an ordinary couple. But ordinary can be deceptive. Behind closed doors, shadows grew. His colleagues began noticing scratches on his arms, marks across his face. When asked, he dismissed them as accidents, clumsy moments at home, mishaps at work. His easy smile and reserved nature made people stop asking. But those marks told a different story. Berlina was jealous. Not the kind of jealousy that flickers and fades, but the consuming kind. Possessive, controlling. During arguments, she scratched him, hit him, and once in a fury poured boiling water on his skin. Scalding liquid that left burns and scars. Why did he stay? That is a question that arises in every case like this. The answers are never simple. Sometimes it is hope that the violence was temporary, that change will come. Sometimes it is fear of what might happen if they try to leave. Sometimes it is exhaustion, the slow depletion of someone who has spent years walking on eggshells until leaving feels harder than staying. For Mark, it may have been all of these. But by the summer of 2015, something had shifted. He had met someone new. Her name was Violet, a nurse whose work was caring for others. Through her, Mark began to see what love could look like when it was not twisted by suspicion and violence. He realized that what he had endured with Berlina was not love at all. It was control, it was harm. And he decided he could no longer stay. In August of that year, he told Berlina the truth. He was leaving. Their relationship was over. He had met someone else. For many people, such a conversation is painful but survivable. For Berlina, it became a fracture she could not accept. In her mind, if she could not have him, then no one could. And that belief would soon lead her down a path of research calculation, and ultimately a purchase that revealed her intent in the starkest possible way. In less than 5 minutes, a man's decision to walk toward freedom would collide with a woman's refusal to let go. And what began as a relationship built on shared understanding would turn into one of the most shocking crimes Bristol had ever seen. He was a young man who had crossed the channel in search of a new chapter. At 24, Mark carried the steady presence of someone who preferred building bridges and solving problems to chasing attention. His move from the Netherlands to Bristol was meant to open doors, to offer the independence of a career and the adventure of a different country. Colleagues at his engineering firm described him as methodical, reliable, and polite. He blended into the rhythm of his new home, quickly keeping most of his private thoughts to himself. Yet beneath his quiet exterior, he longed for companionship. Berlina was older, 37, a fashion design student from South Africa. She lived with an intensity that drew notice. Where Mark's nature was reserved, hers demanded to be seen. She had been in Bristol for some years, creating an identity that balanced study with the challenges of living far from her homeland. She too carried a private burden, and like Mark, she found herself drawn to an online dating website created specifically for people living with HIV. Within that digital refuge, shame was stripped away. Both understood the sting of stigma. Both wanted connection without judgment. It was there their profiles crossed. Messages turned into calls, calls into meetings, and meetings into the decision to build something together. On the surface, they looked like a couple drawn by opposites. He was steady, she was impulsive. He worked as an engineer, she dreamed of couture collections. He preferred quiet nights, she thrived on intensity. For a while those differences appeared complementary. Each filled a space the other lacked. Soon they moved in together. For 5 years, they built routines that looked ordinary from the outside. Mark paid bills. Berlina studied, they dined together, argued about small things, and shared the kind of domestic space that friends assumed was a sign of stability. To casual observers, theirs was an arrangement rooted in mutual understanding, and perhaps even love. But ordinary can conceal fractures. In the privacy of their home, tension brewed that colleagues and neighbors could only glimpse in fleeting signs. People at Mark's workplace noticed scratches on his forearms and small marks across his cheek. When asked, he brushed it off with easy excuses. A slip at work, a clumsy stumble at home, nothing serious. He smiled as he explained away injuries, and his polite manner discouraged further questions. Yet the marks returned often enough to suggest something more. In truth, they were the result of arguments that escalated beyond words. Berlina's jealousy began small questions about who he had spoken to, suspicions about where he spent his time. But soon her possessiveness grew louder. She checked on him constantly, demanded explanations for the smallest delays, accused him of straying. When reassurance did not soothe her, she lashed out. She scratched him during fights. She struck him more than once. In one disturbing episode, she poured boiling water on him, an act of deliberate cruelty that left burns hidden beneath his clothing. Friends later admitted they did not understand why he stayed. But those who work with survivors of domestic violence know the answer is never simple. Victims often remain out of hope, fear, or exhaustion. Hope that the partner will change. Fear that leaving will provoke worse harm. Exhaustion from years of walking on eggshells until leaving feels harder than enduring. Mark embodied this silence. He rarely confided in others. He wanted to believe in the good within her, even when that belief cost him his own safety. The cycle repeated itself. A fight erupted, injuries followed, an apology came, and calm returned for a while. Then the tension resurfaced, stronger each time. Abuse often follows this loop. tightening its hold on those caught within it. Each time, Mark endured the possibility of leaving seemed to shrink further away. What once looked like partnership now resembled captivity under the guise of love. And yet, even within that darkness, he carried the same gentle manner he always had. He kept working, kept showing up, kept wearing the same small smile that shielded his private life from public view. But inside, cracks widened. His patience wore thin. By the summer of 2015, he began to imagine freedom, to consider what his life might look like outside the shadow of Berlina's jealousy. It was then that he met someone who made those thoughts real. A nurse named Violet entered his life, offering him kindness without strings, compassion without suspicion. Through her, he saw that love could be something different, something healing rather than destructive. Violet did not know it, but she had become the spark that made him realize staying was no longer possible. Mark reached the point where he could no longer hide behind excuses. The injuries, the arguments, the endless cycle had drained him. Meeting Violet gave him courage. In August of that year, he told Berlina the truth. Their relationship was finished. He had found someone new. He was leaving. To many, that would have been the end. A painful breakup, perhaps bitter, but final. For Berlina, it was only the beginning. She could not accept his decision. In her mind, she still owned him. And if she could not have him, then no one else ever would. The longer Mark stayed in that relationship, the more unstable Berlina became. What had started as suspicion sharpened into constant surveillance. She called him at work repeatedly, demanding to know where he was and who he spoke with. She checked his phone, interrogated him about every delay, and when his explanations did not satisfy her, she accused him of betrayal. For Berlina, love was no longer a bond between equals. It was a possession. Mark was no longer seen as a man with his own thoughts and choices. He was in her eyes something to be owned, controlled, and punished whenever he resisted. This shift showed itself in her actions. Neighbors sometimes heard raised voices through the thin walls of their building. Arguments stretched late into the night. Friends who visited described an atmosphere heavy with tension, as though anger lingered in the air, even when no words were spoken. Mark's colleagues saw the marks on his arms and face grow more frequent. His excuses never changed: an accident at home, a slip at work. But the pattern was undeniable. He was being hurt by the person who claimed to love him. The most shocking incident before the final tragedy came when Berlina reached for a kettle. In the middle of an argument, she lifted it and hurled boiling water across the room. It struck him, leaving painful burns. He covered the wounds with long sleeves, trying to hide the truth, but those closest to him could sense something was very wrong. This act revealed her willingness to cross into deliberate cruelty. It was not a momentary lapse. It was a choice to cause harm, to scar him, as a way of reinforcing her control. Psychologists who study abuse describe this pattern as escalation. A relationship that begins with criticism and jealousy gradually moves toward intimidation, then physical violence, and finally calculated acts meant to assert dominance completely. Berlina's behavior followed this path almost exactly. Each fight ended with an apology, each apology smoothed over just enough to keep Mark from leaving. Then the cycle would begin again, louder and more violent each time. Why did he stay? It is a question people often ask in hindsight. The answers are complex. Victims remain in abusive relationships for reasons outsiders rarely understand. Sometimes it is fear of retaliation. Sometimes it is financial dependence. Sometimes it is simple exhaustion, the sense that leaving will require more strength than they have left. And often there is hope, the fragile hope that the person they once loved will return, that the violence is temporary, that things will get better. Mark embodied all of these struggles. He hoped, he feared, and he concealed. Behind closed doors, the reality was dark. She scratched him until his arms bled. She struck him with open hands. She shouted insults meant to reduce him. The kettle of boiling water was the clearest warning, but not the only one. Each act of violence reinforced the cycle of dominance. Each scar marked another piece of his life that was being eroded. Berlina's jealousy did not fade when he tried to reassure her. In fact, reassurance seemed to fuel her suspicion further. The more he denied wrongdoing, the more convinced she became that he was lying. This is a hallmark of coercive control. No amount of explanation satisfies because the partner has already decided guilt exists. For Berlina, jealousy was proof of her love. For Mark, it became a prison he could not escape. Those who saw him during this time described a man whose smile had dimmed. He still worked diligently, still carried himself with politeness, but something in his expression suggested fatigue deeper than lack of sleep. He seemed smaller somehow, as though the constant pressure inside his home was crushing the person he had once been. And though he never spoke openly about it, the evidence was written across his body. The boiling water incident should have been a final warning. It should have been the moment he left the proof that staying placed him in mortal danger. But like so many victims, Mark stayed. Perhaps he believed it would not happen again. Perhaps he told himself that leaving would make things worse. Perhaps he simply felt too tired to fight anymore. Abuse wears people down slowly until even survival feels uncertain. What Berlina gained from these episodes was not love, it was power. Each time she lashed out and he stayed, she felt her control grow stronger. She learned that she could hurt him and still keep him near. That realization emboldened her. By the summer of 2015, when he finally found the courage to tell her the relationship was over, she was already operating from a mindset where losing him was unacceptable. In her view, if he dared to leave, the ultimate act of control would be to destroy him completely. And once that thought took hold, she began to plan. The scratches, the bruises, the boiling water, they were only the prelude. What came next would be far more deliberate, far more devastating, and it would leave scars no hospital could ever repair. By the middle of that summer, Mark was exhausted. He had endured years of suspicion arguments and physical violence, carrying the weight of it quietly, as though silence could protect him. But silence had only deepened his isolation. He wanted more from life than constant tension and fear. When he met Violet, a nurse who radiated kindness and calm, the contrast was so stark that he could not ignore it. She was someone who cared for others in her work, who listened without judgment, who offered gentleness instead of anger. For Mark, being near her was like glimpsing sunlight after years in shadow. Violet represented the possibility of a different life. She was not controlling or suspicious. She encouraged him instead of belittling him. She reminded him that love should be nurturing rather than destructive. Through her, Mark began to recognize that what he had endured with Berlina was not love at all. It was coercion, disguised as affection, fear masked as devotion. He realized he had been living in a cage built out of jealousy and violence. And once that realization crystallized, he could no longer pretend things might change. In August of 2015, he made the decision to end it. He told Berlina their relationship was finished. He admitted he had met someone new. He said he was leaving. For most couples, even the most troubled, such words would mean a painful breakup followed eventually by separation. For Berlina, it was unthinkable. In her mind, he was still hers. His announcement that he was choosing another woman felt like the ultimate betrayal, and she refused to accept it. Friends later noticed that her behavior grew even more erratic in the weeks that followed. She called him constantly, demanded explanations, and accused him of lies he never told. Psychologists who reviewed the case described her actions as obsessive possessiveness and the refusal to acknowledge the autonomy of another person. She was determined to maintain control, even as he tried to escape it, and in her obsession, she turned to planning. On September 2nd, she walked into a shop and made a purchase that revealed her intent in the clearest possible terms. She bought a liter of sulfuric acid, concentrated to 98%. Not the diluted solution found in some cleaners, but the industrial kind that burns through metal and human tissue with equal efficiency. This was not impulsive, it was calculated. Investigators would later find more than 80 internet searches on her computer about sulfuric acid. She had read about what it did to skin. She had studied cases where it had been used against people. She knew its permanence, its ability to blind, disfigure, and disable. She knew exactly what she was buying, and she bought it anyway. The bottle remained in her flat for 3 weeks. 21 days of waiting, of living side by side with the instrument of destruction she had chosen. Did she look at it each morning, reassuring herself that it was there? Did she imagine how it would feel to pour it to watch him suffer? We cannot know the details of her private thoughts, but the outcome proves she was resolved. This was not a sudden moment of rage. It was deliberate, and it was planned. Mark, meanwhile, remained in the flat despite ending the relationship. Perhaps he felt guilty about leaving after so many years. Perhaps he wanted to soften the blow before moving out completely. Perhaps he simply had nowhere else to go in that moment. Whatever the reason, he continued to sleep under the same roof, unaware that the woman beside him had already decided how she would punish him for his choice. The days passed in uneasy silence. She had her plan, he had his hope. Violet had become the image of a future that finally seemed possible. For Mark, the worst felt behind him. He had endured years of jealousy and pain, but he believed he was on the edge of freedom. What he did not know was that he was living in a countdown each day, bringing him closer to the moment when Berlina would act. This is the dangerous truth about relationships poisoned by control. Leaving is often the most dangerous time. When an abuser senses their power slipping away, they sometimes escalate to the most extreme measures. Berlina was not willing to lose control. In her mind, if she could not keep him, then she would destroy him. And with a bottle of acid hidden in her flat, she was prepared to do exactly that. Mark's friends noticed that he seemed lighter as he spoke of Violet, though he never revealed the depth of what he was escaping. He allowed himself to imagine new beginnings, evenings without shouting, days without hidden bruises. For the first time in years, he looked toward the future with cautious hope. That hope was real, but it was fragile, and it would soon collide with the darkest expression of Berlina's jealousy. Because one early morning when the city was asleep and the streets were still, she would lift the bottle she had studied for weeks, and in that act she would change his life forever. The hour was early, that quiet stretch of night when the city seems to hold its breath. In the flat they had once shared as partners, Mark lay asleep, unaware that the person who once claimed to love him was standing nearby with a bottle in her hand. For 3 weeks, that bottle had waited. She had researched, she had imagined, she had decided. And now, with the silence of dawn around her, Berlina crossed the line between thought and action. She tilted the container, and the liquid inside spilled across his face and body. Sulfuric acid does not simply burn. It reacts violently with moisture, releasing heat as it corrodes everything it touches. It eats through skin, muscle, and tissue. It blinds, scars, and disables within seconds. Mark woke instantly, not to the sound of alarm, but to pain so fierce it shattered his world. The acid covered his eyes, his mouth, his nose cascading down, his torso, arms, and legs. His screams tore through the flat, through the building, and into the night. Neighbors later described those screams as unlike anything they had ever heard. Not only pain, but terror, the raw voice of a man being destroyed in real time. He stumbled from the bed, blinded and disoriented, every nerve ending aflame. Somehow, through instinct alone, he made his way out of the flat and onto the street. His body was on fire without flames. His skin was melting while he was still conscious, and yet he moved because to remain inside was to die. On the street, his cries carried. Lights flicked on in windows, doors opened. People emerged horrified at the sight before them. Mark's face was disfigured, his clothing burned away in places, his body covered in liquid that continued to eat through him. The smell was acrid, chemical, unforgettable. Someone called for emergency help. Others tried to comfort him, but there was little anyone could do. The acid clung to him unrelenting. Paramedics arrived within minutes, though. To Mark, it must have felt like hours. They were seasoned professionals who had seen traffic accidents, overdoses, stabbings, but nothing prepared them for this. They saw a man whose face and body had been dissolved, whose screams made clear that he was still fully aware of what had happened to him. They flushed his wounds with water, knowing that every second mattered, but the damage was already catastrophic. He was rushed to the hospital, under lights and sirens, his body fighting to survive even as the acid continued its work. In the emergency room, doctors recognized the pattern of the injuries immediately. The burns were deep, extensive, and clearly caused by sulfuric acid. They worked frantically to stabilize him. Nearly a quarter of his body was covered in critical burns. His left eye was destroyed completely, his right eye severely damaged. His nose, lips, and ears bore the full mark of corrosion. His torso, arms, and legs were burned in patches that went beyond surface skin into deeper tissue. Beyond the visible damage, his body was in shock, his nervous system overwhelmed, his blood chemistry destabilized. Within hours, he slipped into a coma. For weeks, he remained suspended between life and death. His family flew in from the Netherlands, sitting at his bedside, listening to the machines that kept him alive. When he finally woke 4 months later, the truth of his condition became clear. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He could no longer move his arms or legs. He could not dress himself, feed himself, or live without constant care. His sight was almost completely gone. His pain was constant, sharp, unrelenting. Burns do not end with the moment of injury. They continue to torment as scar tissue pulls against skin, as nerve endings misfire, as infections threaten daily. Mark could think, though. He was conscious, aware, trapped inside a body that had been destroyed. Communication was possible only through the slow movement of his tongue against his teeth, spelling out letters to form words. It was agonizing, painstaking, but it was all he had left. And through this method he delivered words that revealed the depth of his suffering. Among the first phrases he formed were not about his attacker, not about revenge, but about himself. He asked for release. He spelled out, "Kill me now." His father, seated at his bedside, watched his son struggle to form those words. Doctors tried surgeries, pain management, even amputation of one leg when complications made it necessary. Nothing could give him back his independence. Nothing could free him from the agony. He was only 29, but his life had been reduced to endless pain, dependence, and the knowledge that the person who once said she loved him had chosen to destroy him. The night of the attack ended in survival, but it was a survival more cruel than death. And as weeks turned into months, Mark understood that the rest of his life would be lived in a prison built not of bars but of pain and loss. For him, the attack was not only an act of violence. It was the end of every dream he had carried, the erasure of the life he once imagined. In the weeks that followed, the attack Bristol's Southmead Hospital became the center of Mark's existence. The burns that covered his body demanded immediate and ongoing care. Surgeons performed emergency debridement, scraping away dead tissue to try to prevent infection. Nurses monitored him, constantly aware that burn patients are among the most vulnerable in any ward. Even a small infection could become fatal, and his wounds were anything but small. Entire areas of his face and body had been destroyed. At first he remained in a coma. Machines breathed for him, fed him, and delivered fluids. His father traveled from the Netherlands and sat at his bedside for hours, listening to the hiss of oxygen, the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Family members described the heartbreak of seeing him motionless, unrecognizable from the young man they had known. When he finally opened his eyes, 4 months later, relief was tempered by reality. The damage was irreversible. Doctors explained to him what the attack had done. His left eye was gone, completely melted away by the acid. His right eye was severely damaged and would eventually fail as well. His face had lost its familiar features, reshaped by scars and tissue loss. His mouth, nose, and ears bore the permanent mark of chemical destruction. The acid had cascaded down his chest and arms, searing deep into muscle. The shock of the injuries had triggered damage to his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. The prognosis was devastating. He would never walk again. He would never feed himself, dress himself, or live independently. He would need 24-hour care for the rest of his life. The doctors did not sugarcoat the truth. They told him that pain would be constant, that recovery meant learning to endure, not regaining what had been lost. For many patients with severe burns, the pain is described as worse than the disfigurement. Skin grafts pull scars, tighten nerves, misfire. For Mark, every day was agony. His method of communication was painstaking. Unable to move his limbs, he used his tongue against his teeth to spell letters one at a time. It was exhausting, but it gave him a voice. Through this method, he spelled out words to his father, to the medical staff, to the people who still surrounded him. Among those words was the name Violet, the woman he had hoped to build a future with. Even in his suffering, he thought of her. He also expressed something darker, something that revealed the depth of his despair. "Kill me now," he spelled out slowly, painfully. Those words shook everyone around him. They were not the angry words of someone in the moment of pain. They were the considered plea of a man who understood what his future had become. He knew he would never regain his independence. He knew he would never escape the pain. He knew that everything he had once hoped for had been taken from him in a matter of minutes. In the months that followed, his condition grew even more complex. Surgeons amputated his lower left leg, the tissue too damaged to save. He battled infections, underwent multiple operations, and faced the relentless grind of rehabilitation. Yet no surgery could restore his sight, his movement, or his former life. The hospital staff admired his resilience, but they could not give him back what he had lost. His suffering remained constant, both physical and psychological. For his father sitting by his side, the experience was unbearable. To see a son transformed from a healthy, independent young man into someone trapped in a body that no longer worked was almost more than he could bear. Friends who visited struggled to recognize him, not just because of the disfigurement, but because of the weight of despair that clung to him. Mark's case soon became not just a medical crisis, but an ethical one. He was Dutch by birth, and in the Netherlands, euthanasia was legal under strict circumstances. In Belgium, too, the law permitted euthanasia if multiple doctors agreed that suffering was unbearable and without prospect of improvement. Mark began to consider this path seriously. It was not a decision made in haste. It was the decision of a man who had lived through 15 months of agony, who understood that this was not a temporary state, but a permanent one. Doctors in Belgium assessed him. They confirmed what his British physicians had already said. His suffering was constant, his pain was unrelenting, his condition would never improve. He retained full mental capacity, and his request was considered informed, deliberate, and consistent. 3 separate consultants agreed that he met the criteria. On the 2nd of January 2017, Mark ended his suffering through legal euthanasia in Belgium. He was 29 years old. His father was at his side when the moment came. For a man who had spent his career as an engineer, building and creating it, was a bitter truth that the last act of control he could exercise over his own life was choosing when to end it. The courtroom later would wrestle with this fact. Berlina had been arrested soon after the attack and charged with attempted murder, but now Mark was dead. Could she be charged with murder even though his death came by euthanasia, rather than by immediate injury? The legal questions were complicated, and the answers would spark outrage and debate. For the family, however, the law mattered less than the reality. Their son, their brother, their friend was gone. His life had been stolen in a moment of cruelty. His final 15 months had been nothing but suffering. His story had become not just about violence, but about the human right to dignity, the limits of endurance, and the cost of obsession. When Mark died in Belgium, the case moved from the hospital ward into the courtroom. Berlina had already been arrested shortly after the attack and was facing charges of attempted murder and of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. His death complicated everything. The prosecution now considered whether to pursue a murder charge. The question was simple. On its surface, she had poured acid over him, he had suffered catastrophic injuries, and 15 months later, he was dead. But the circumstances of his death raised unprecedented legal questions. In British law, causation is a central principle. To convict someone of murder, the prosecution must prove that the defendant's actions caused the victim's death. In this case, Berlina's actions had caused injuries so severe that Mark chose to end his life through euthanasia. Did that choice break the chain of causation? Was Berlina guilty of murder, or was she guilty only of the attack itself, since his death came by his own decision? Lawyers debated fiercely, and the case quickly became one of the most legally complex trials the city of Bristol had seen in years. The prosecution argued that Berlina's intent had been clear. She had researched acid attacks 82 times on her computer. She had purchased a bottle of highly concentrated sulfuric acid weeks before she used it. She had told Mark in the middle of the attack, "If I can't have you, no one can." These were not the actions of someone who lost control in a moment. They were deliberate, calculated, and carried out with full knowledge of the consequences. The fact that Mark had later chosen euthanasia, they argued, did not absolve her. His decision was a direct response to the agony she had inflicted. Without her, he would still be alive. The defense countered that while she had intended to harm him, she had not intended to kill him. They argued that acid attacks, while devastating, are often committed with the intention of disfigurement rather than death. They claimed that Mark's decision to end his life was an independent act, one that legally broke the causal chain. They emphasized that she should be held accountable for grievous bodily harm, but not for murder. The courtroom listened to harrowing testimony. Doctors described the extent of Mark's injuries in precise clinical terms. They explained how acid penetrates tissue, how burns of more than 20% of the body are life-threatening, and how Mark had lived with 25% of his body burned. They described the surgeries, the amputations, the constant pain. Nurses spoke of his suffering, of the way he communicated with his tongue against his teeth to form words slowly, painfully. His father told the jury about sitting at his bedside, about hearing his son spell out, "Kill me now," about the months of unrelenting agony that led to the decision for euthanasia. The emotional weight in the courtroom was heavy. Reporters noted that jurors wiped tears as they listened. Yet the legal question remained, did Berlina's attack cause his death, or did his own decision break that link? When the jury finally returned their verdict, in May of 2018, the result reflected this complexity. They found Berlina guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. They found her not guilty of murder. The reasoning was that while she had caused catastrophic injuries, his decision to undergo euthanasia was considered an intervening act that legally broke the chain of causation. For many, this verdict was infuriating. How could she not be guilty of murder when her actions had so clearly destroyed his life and led to his death? Judge Nicola Davies, in delivering the sentence, did not soften her words. She told Berlina that what she had done was an act of pure evil. She noted the planning, the research, the 3 weeks during which the bottle of acid sat in her flat as she waited to use it. She spoke of Mark's unimaginable pain, his 15 months of suffering, and the life stolen from him. She sentenced Berlina to life imprisonment with a minimum of 12 years before she would be eligible for parole. 12 years. For many it seemed inadequate. For deliberately causing such horror, for reducing a young man's life to 15 months of agony, 12 years before the possibility of release felt insufficient. But others pointed out that the jury's decision hinged on legal definitions, not moral outrage. They had accepted that Mark's choice of euthanasia broke the chain of causation. As a result, the harshest charge could not stand. Outside, the courtroom debate raged. Victims' advocates argued that the law should change, that perpetrators of attacks leading to euthanasia should still face murder charges. Legal scholars dissected the reasoning, pointing out that the law of causation has always required difficult boundaries. Families of other victims of acid attacks spoke about their fear and frustration, pointing to the rising number of such assaults in the United Kingdom. Lawmakers began to discuss tighter restrictions on the sale of concentrated acids, recognizing that substances sold openly could be used as weapons. For Mark's family, the verdict did little to ease their grief. His father had sat through the trial, listening to every detail of his son's suffering recounted in court. He heard Berlina's words repeated, "If I can't have you, no one can." He watched as the jury concluded that this was not murder. He left the court with the knowledge that his son's suffering had not been fully recognized by the law. Yet within the courtroom the decision was final. Berlina Wallace was led away to begin her sentence. Mark's story ended not with justice that satisfied everyone, but with a reminder of how fragile life is when love becomes possession and possession becomes obsession. The law had spoken, but the questions it raised lingered. What do we owe to victims of unbearable suffering, and how do we hold accountable those who cause it when the victim chooses to end their pain? Far from the rainy streets of Bristol, across an ocean, and in a landscape as different as possible, another story was beginning. This one unfolded under the vast skies of the American West, in a desert where the horizon seemed endless and silence stretched for miles. It was here that a 19-year-old named Dylan Rounds was building a dream that belonged to him alone. Dylan was not the kind of teenager who spent evenings in dorm rooms or weekends at parties. While many his age were navigating college or part-time jobs, Dylan had set his sights on something far more ambitious. He wanted to be a farmer, not in fertile valleys or near bustling towns, but in the remote desert of Box Elder County, Utah. The land he chose was near Lucin, so far from cities that it barely appeared on maps. Out there, neighbors could be miles away, and cell phone service was a rare luxury. He came from Idaho, raised in a family that valued hard work and independence. Those who knew him described him as determined beyond his years. His hands were weathered from labor, his eyes bright with focus. He was young, but his vision was clear. He had bought land not much more than sagebrush and soil, but to him it was full of promise. He lived in a camper van on the property, rising with the sun and working until the heat became unbearable. When supplies ran low, he returned to Idaho for showers and groceries, but mostly he stayed in the desert, preparing his first crop. His parents, Justin and Candace, worried as any parents would. They knew isolation carried risks. Accidents could happen, weather could turn, strangers could appear. But Dylan called regularly, sending photos, sharing updates about his progress. He was resourceful and capable. He believed in what he was doing, and his parents admired that even as they carried private concern. Lucin was more than remote. It was harsh, unforgiving. The soil was dry, the wind sharp, the sun relentless. Yet Dylan seemed at peace with it. He talked about irrigation, planting schedules, the way the land might eventually provide. He was 19, but his ambition belonged to someone much older. He saw potential where others saw only dust. On Saturday, May 28, 2022, the desert sky changed. Rain began to fall, unusual enough in that region to be remembered. For Dylan, it was not just weather, it was a concern. He had a truck loaded with seed parked outside. If the rain reached it, if water damaged what he needed for planting, it could set back months of work. That afternoon, he called his grandmother. It was the kind of call he often made, brief but affectionate. He told her he could not talk long. He needed to move his truck into the shed before the rain ruined his seed. That was the last time his family heard his voice. At first, no one thought much of the silence. Dylan sometimes lost cell service. Sometimes he became so focused on his work that he forgot to call for a day. But when Sunday passed with no word, then Monday, and then Tuesday, the concern grew. His parents knew their son. He always checked in. He always made sure they knew he was safe. This silence was not like him. On May 30th, his parents reported him missing to the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office. Deputies drove out to his farm. They found his camper, his equipment, his belongings. His truck was there too, but Dylan was gone. No signs of a struggle were obvious at first glance. It was as though he had stepped into the desert and vanished. The search began immediately, but the desert swallowed clues as easily as it swallowed sound. Volunteers combed through sagebrush and ravines. Helicopters scanned from above. Dogs were brought to sniff for scent. Nothing. Out there, the land could hide almost anything. The emptiness itself became an obstacle. Every direction looked the same. Every trail faded into sand and rock. Investigators considered the obvious. Maybe he had gotten injured, lost his way, or collapsed from heat. Maybe he had gone further than expected and could not return. But as hours became days, the ordinary explanations grew thin. His belongings were untouched. His truck remained. There were no footprints leading away, no trail to follow. The desert offered silence instead of answers. For his family, the waiting was unbearable. They called for updates, drove the long roads to his farm, walked the ground themselves. Their son, their 19-year-old boy, with the weathered hands and endless determination, was gone. And though no one could yet see it, the explanation would not lie in accident or misfortune. It would lie in the presence of others who lived near Dylan's patch of desert men, whose histories were darker than the Utah night. At first, Dylan's parents tried to convince themselves that everything was fine. Perhaps his phone had lost service again, as it often did in that part of Utah. Perhaps he had thrown himself into work and simply forgotten to check in. But as each day passed, the silence grew heavier. By the third day, without a word, worry had hardened into fear. This was not the son they knew. Dylan was responsible, reliable, and deeply aware of how much his parents worried. He would not let days pass without contact. On May 30th, they called the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office. Deputies agreed to investigate, though even reaching Dylan's property required a long drive across dirt roads and open stretches of desert. When they arrived, they found the small camper van where he had been living. Inside were his clothes, his wallet, and personal belongings. His boots, oddly, were not on his feet, but nearby. His truck, the one he had mentioned moving into the shed, was there as well. Yet Dylan himself was nowhere to be found. The deputies began a search, though the landscape presented unique challenges. Out there, the horizon stretched in every direction. Sagebrush, alkali flats, and rocky gullies could swallow evidence in seconds. A footprint could vanish in the wind. A body could be hidden in a ravine. The desert was not just vast, it was merciless. Volunteers joined the effort. Friends, family, and strangers combed through the scrub brush. They followed dry creek beds, peered into washes, and searched abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned from above their rotors, echoing against the empty sky. Dogs trained in scent detection were brought in, noses pressed against the sand. Yet the land gave back nothing. Dylan had vanished, as though the desert itself had claimed him. His parents, Justin and Candace, walked the property themselves. They retraced his steps, examined the truck, studied the camper. Nothing made sense. If he had wandered away, why leave his boots? Investigators considered the simplest explanations first. Maybe Dylan had fallen injured himself and was waiting for rescue somewhere nearby. But after days of searching, no trace of him appeared. The theory began to shift. Accidents leave clues: a broken branch, a trail, a body eventually found. Dylan's disappearance carried a different silence. It was as though someone had erased him. As the days dragged on, the family's dread deepened. They returned each night without answers, their hope thinning like the desert air. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting images of Dylan, describing him as a determined young man with weathered hands and big dreams. Neighbors in Idaho and Utah joined search parties, unwilling to accept that someone so young and focused could simply vanish. The sheriff's office began to widen their scope. They questioned people who lived in the remote stretches near Dylan's land. In such isolation, neighbors were few, but each one mattered. Among them were men with histories far different from Dylan's men, whose pasts carried records of violence and crime. Their names would soon become central to the investigation. For now, the search pressed on, but with every day that ended in failure, the sense of dread grew stronger. Dylan's grandmother replayed her last conversation with him, the simple phone call about moving a truck before the rain. His parents replayed every message he had sent, every photograph of the farm he hoped to build. Each memory became heavier, a reminder that they had no new ones to replace them. By the end of the first week, the silence had turned unbearable. Dylan was gone, the desert held its secrets, and the family knew what investigators were beginning to admit quietly: this was no ordinary missing persons case. The land alone could not explain it. Something else had happened, something darker, and the answer lay not in the emptiness of the desert, but in the people who lived within it. As investigators widened their search for answers, their attention turned toward the people who shared the remote desert with Dylan. In such an isolated place, every neighbor mattered, because even one chance encounter could shift a life. Among those who lived nearby was a man named James Brenner. At 59 years old, he was not a farmer like Dylan. He was a drifter, a squatter surviving in the wasteland with little more than a shack and a long history of trouble behind him. Brenner's past stretched back 4 decades, and it was heavy with crime. His record revealed a pattern of violence, theft, and weapons charges. He had spent time in prison, and by law he was prohibited from owning firearms. Yet those who knew him understood that rules rarely stopped him. In the desert, away from oversight, Brenner did as he pleased. He carried weapons despite his convictions. He lived without concern for neighbors. To him, the isolation was freedom, a place where no one could interfere. For Dylan, the proximity of a man like Brenner was dangerous in ways he could not have anticipated. Investigators learned that the two had crossed paths. Tensions had formed over something as small as where Dylan parked his vehicles. Out in the wide openness of Lucin, such disputes seemed absurd, but isolation changes perspective. Small irritations become large conflicts when there are no mediators, no social ties to diffuse anger. For Brenner, who had spent a lifetime feeding his rage, the presence of a determined 19-year-old trying to build a future became intolerable. Another figure also appeared in the investigation, a man named Chase Venstra. He too lived on the fringes of the desert and had a criminal past. Both men had interacted with Dylan in the days before he disappeared. Investigators questioned them, piecing together accounts of where they had been and what they had done. Suspicion began to gather around Brenner, in particular not only because of his proximity, but because of what surfaced next. 3 weeks after Dylan vanished, a crucial discovery was made. Searchers recovered his cell phone from a pond not far from his farm. The device had been deliberately discarded, an attempt to hide or destroy it. Water damage made analysis difficult, but forensic specialists have ways of pulling data even from broken electronics. When the phone was examined, it yielded something chilling. On that phone was a video file only 75 seconds long. It was not a planned recording. It had been captured by accident while Dylan was using the time-lapse function, a feature often used to record progress in farming or construction. But what the phone captured was no crop, no landscape. It showed a man, and that man appeared to be James Brenner. In the video, Brenner's shirt was stained with blood. His arms were smeared as well. He sat cleaning a gun, methodical and precise, wiping its surface with the care of someone determined to remove evidence. Investigators who viewed the footage felt a chill. This was not speculation, it was visual proof. Dylan's phone had recorded the aftermath of violence. The teenager's dream of farming had been interrupted by a man with a history of destruction, and the evidence of it was right there in digital form. The discovery shifted the entire case. Dylan's disappearance was no longer treated as a search for a missing person. It was treated as a homicide investigation. His parents were told about the video, though not every detail. What they understood was enough: their son had encountered Brenner, and that encounter had ended with violence. The desert had not swallowed Dylan randomly. A neighbor had. For investigators, the challenge remained. They did not yet have Dylan's body. They could not yet say exactly how he had died. But they had Brenner's record, Brenner's proximity, and now a piece of footage that tied him to a weapon and to blood. It was not enough for immediate conviction, but it was enough to begin building the case piece by piece. Meanwhile, Dylan's parents lived in limbo. Each day without answers felt endless. They returned to the desert repeatedly, standing in the place where he had dreamed of planting fields, staring at the emptiness that had taken him. They could not yet bury him, could not yet close the chapter. All they had was hope that justice, however slow, would one day come. And quietly, investigators continued to peel back the layers of Brenner's life, determined to uncover every secret he had tried to bury in the sands of Utah. When investigators first recovered Dylan's phone from the pond near Lucin, it looked like little more than a ruined piece of metal and glass. The desert sun had baked it, the water had soaked it, and whoever had thrown it there had surely assumed it would never yield anything. But modern forensic labs specialize in pulling secrets from broken devices. Specialists dried it, carefully dismantled it, and extracted fragments of data. What they uncovered transformed the investigation. Among the recovered files was a video clip only 75 seconds long. It had been recorded not by intention, but by accident, a side effect of Dylan running the time-lapse feature. He had set it up before his disappearance, likely to capture progress on his farm. But instead of crops or sky, the lens caught something else entirely. The footage showed James Brenner. In the video, Brenner's shirt bore dark stains. His arms were smeared as well. He was cleaning a gun with deliberate care, running cloth across the barrel, the receiver, the trigger guard. The frame revealed enough detail that investigators could not mistake it. This was not ordinary maintenance. It was the meticulous removal of evidence. Blood was visible on his clothing as he worked. Every motion reinforced the sense of a man trying to erase what he had done. The discovery sent chills through the team. They had already suspected Brenner, already seen his criminal record and violent past. But suspicion is not the same as proof. This video was proof. It tied him directly to blood and to a firearm, both in the immediate aftermath of Dylan's disappearance. For investigators, it was like finding a witness who could not be intimidated or silenced. Dylan's phone had captured the evidence his own eyes could no longer testify to. Yet the video was only part of what forensics revealed. Phone records traced Dylan's movements on the day he vanished. The data placed his phone in the same area where Brenner had been squatting. The digital trail and the physical evidence began to align, drawing a map that led directly back to Brenner. Investigators also found Dylan's boots discarded in the desert. They were not on his feet. They had been thrown aside deliberately. Testing revealed blood. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Dylan. Mixed in with it was DNA from Brenner. Each piece of evidence told the same story. The boots placed Dylan and Brenner together in violence. The video showed Brenner with a gun and blood. The discarded phone in the pond revealed a deliberate attempt to hide what had been recorded. This was no accident, no misfortune in the desert. This was homicide. Investigators presented their findings to Dylan's parents. They explained the phone, the boots, the records. For Justin and Candace, the weight of it was unbearable. Their son had not simply vanished. He had been attacked. His dream of farming, his determination to work the land, had ended in blood at the hands of a violent neighbor. The proof lay not in speculation, but in evidence their son had unknowingly preserved. Still, one crucial element was missing. There was no body. Without Dylan's remains, prosecutors knew the case would be harder to argue in court. Defense attorneys thrive on doubt, and the absence of a body can provide fertile ground for claims that the victim might still be alive. Prosecutors wanted certainty, and for now, they did not have it. They chose a different path first. Brenner and another man, Chase Venstra, were both arrested on weapons charges. As convicted felons, neither was allowed to possess firearms, yet both had them. These arrests served multiple purposes. They got Brenner off the streets, they applied pressure, and they bought investigators time to build the homicide case piece by piece. In the desert, the search continued. Volunteers kept combing the land, hoping to find Dylan. Months passed, then seasons. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. His parents endured agonizing limbo. They knew the truth in their hearts, but they had no closure, no place to mourn. The evidence against Brenner grew, but it was not yet complete. The case moved slowly, deliberately, because the weight of justice demanded that when charges came, they would stand. Meanwhile, Dylan's family clung to the knowledge that their son had left behind his own testimony. In the 75 seconds of a shaky video, he had recorded the man who took his life. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors faced the challenge that has haunted countless homicide cases. How do you secure justice without a body? The evidence was mounting. Dylan's phone, the video showing James Brenner cleaning a gun while stained with blood, the boots with DNA from both men, the cell records placing them in the same area. Still, defense attorneys could argue that without remains there was no proof of death. For the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office, and for prosecutors in Utah, building a strong case meant patience. Brenner was already behind bars. Arrested on firearms charges, he faced prison time simply for possessing guns as a convicted felon. This gave investigators breathing room. They knew he was dangerous, but at least he was not free to roam the desert. It also applied pressure. Being held in custody kept him isolated, facing the possibility of more serious charges once the homicide case solidified. Alongside him, Chase Venstra, another man with a record, was also jailed on weapons violations. Their presence in custody allowed investigators to keep tightening the net. Behind the scenes, detectives pieced together every fragment. They traced Brenner's movements in the days surrounding Dylan's disappearance. Witnesses reported seeing him agitated, even hostile about Dylan's presence and the way he parked his vehicles. Prosecutors gathered testimony about his violent temper and his decades of criminal history. Slowly, a narrative formed that went beyond suspicion. Brenner was not only capable of violence, he had a pattern of it. For Dylan's family, the waiting was agony. Each update carried hope and dread. Hope that answers were near, dread that the desert might never reveal what it had hidden. They pressed for more searches, more resources, refusing to let their son's case fade into silence. The community rallied with them. Volunteers returned again and again to the wide emptiness, scanning sagebrush and gullies, digging where they thought there might be disturbed soil. The land gave nothing back. The sheriff's office coordinated with federal agencies, expanding their forensic analysis. They knew the boots with Dylan's blood were damning. They knew the video from his phone was nearly impossible for the defense to explain away. But they also knew that juries look for certainty. Without a body, without an official cause of death, reasonable doubt could creep in. Prosecutors weighed their timing carefully, choosing to wait to build a case that would withstand attack from every angle. Brenner sat in jail, and with each passing month, the evidence stacked higher. The community began to speak of him openly as the man who had killed Dylan, though legally, the charge had not yet been filed. Media outlets covered the case with growing intensity. Still, the family lived in torment. Justin and Candace spoke to reporters, pleading for information, urging anyone with knowledge to come forward. They carried photographs of their son, the teenager with calloused hands and bright eyes who dreamed of turning desert soil into crops. They reminded the world that Dylan was not just a case file. He was their boy, and he had been stolen from them. Forensic experts reviewed the video again and again. They described Brenner's movements, the presence of blood on his shirt and arms, the way he focused on wiping the weapon clean. They explained that such footage captured by accident was among the strongest forms of digital evidence because it was not staged or manipulated. Combined with the boots, the DNA, and the timeline, it painted a picture difficult to deny. By early 2023, prosecutors made their move. They charged James Brenner with aggravated murder and with abuse or desecration of a human body. The charging documents laid out the case. Clearly, Dylan's phone had captured video of Brenner cleaning a gun while covered in blood. Dylan's boots bore blood and Brenner's DNA, and Dylan had disappeared permanently after a conflict with Brenner. Though the body remained missing, the evidence was overwhelming. The family attended the hearings, sitting in courtrooms where Brenner appeared in shackles. They listened as prosecutors read the evidence into the record. They watched him plead not guilty. Their grief mingled with anger, but also with determination. At last the law had named him publicly for what they already knew in their hearts. He was the man who had taken their son. Even so, closure remained elusive. They still had no remains to bury, no grave to visit, no final goodbye. The trial loomed ahead, but until the desert gave up Dylan's body, there would always be a piece missing. For his parents, justice was not just conviction, it was the chance to bring him home. For nearly 2 years, the desert kept its silence. Searchers had combed the land again and again, but the sagebrush and gullies revealed nothing. Dylan's parents lived in unbearable limbo, knowing in their hearts that their son was gone, yet unable to lay him to rest. Prosecutors pushed forward with charges, but the absence of a body left space for Brenner's defense to argue doubt. What Dylan's family needed most was closure, and for that the desert itself had to speak. On April 9, 2024, something changed. As part of a plea agreement, James Brenner did what he had refused to do. For nearly 2 years, he told authorities where to look. Guided by his directions, deputies from the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office returned to the western desert near Lucin. It was land they had walked before, places they had searched. But this time, they had precision. They dug where Brenner indicated, and in the dry earth, they found skeletal remains. The Utah Medical Examiner's Office conducted testing, though no one doubted who had been found. Soon, the confirmation came. The remains belonged to Dylan Rounds. He had been shot. The news rippled through his family, his community, and all who had followed the case. For Justin and Candace, it was devastating and relieving all at once. Their son was gone, but now they knew where he was. They could bring him home, they could hold a funeral, visit a grave, honor his memory properly. For 2 years they had been denied even that. Investigators documented the site carefully. They photographed, mapped, and collected every fragment of evidence. The desert had done what deserts do, erasing traces with wind and time, but enough remained to confirm the truth. Dylan had been killed by a gunshot, his body hidden in the soil while seasons passed above. The landscape that had once represented his dream of independence had become his grave. With this discovery, the case against Brenner became nearly unassailable. The phone video showed him cleaning the weapon with blood on his clothing. The boots held DNA from both him and Dylan. The cell records placed them together. And now the body was recovered, the cause of death determined. The picture was complete. On May 15, 2024, Brenner stood in Utah's 1st District Court and pleaded guilty. The charge of aggravated murder was reduced to second-degree murder as part of the plea. The charge of desecration of a human body was dismissed. He also pleaded guilty to 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a restricted person. It was not the maximum punishment possible, but it was enough to ensure that he would spend decades behind bars. For Dylan's parents, the plea deal was bittersweet. On one hand, they finally had answers. They finally had their son's body, finally had the chance to say goodbye properly. On the other hand, no sentence could balance the loss. A 19-year-old with endless determination had been killed over a petty dispute, buried in the desert, like refuse, his dreams of farming cut off before they began. Brenner would serve between 3 and 30 years in prison. Dylan would never live another day. Nearly a year later, in March of 2025, investigators released the video publicly. It was just over a minute long. In it, Brenner appeared ordinary, sitting and wiping down a gun. Yet the stains on his shirt and arms revealed the truth. This was not maintenance. This was concealment after murder. The video chilled all who saw it, not because it was dramatic, but because of its mundanity. It showed how casually a man could commit violence and then attempt to erase it. The statistics of the investigation told their own story. More than 5,000 hours had been spent. Hundreds of tips followed. Multiple agencies had contributed. But those numbers could not capture the real cost. They could not measure the sleepless nights. Dylan's parents endured the aching wait for closure, the endless return to the desert, hoping for a sign. When Dylan's remains were returned to his family, his parents held a service. They spoke of his dreams, his stubborn independence, his courage to try something so ambitious at such a young age. They reminded those who came that he was more than a case, more than evidence in a courtroom. He was their son, and he mattered. The desert near Lucin is unchanged. The sagebrush still sways in the wind, the alkali flats shimmer in the heat, and the horizon stretches forever. Dylan's farm is empty now, the land slowly reclaiming itself. But his story lingers in that soil, a reminder of both the fragility of dreams and the violence that can erupt in isolation. For his parents, closure does not mean peace. It means a place to grieve, a place to remember. It means no longer wondering but knowing. And it means carrying forward the memory of a young man who had the courage to build a life where no one else dared, only to have it stolen by a neighbor's rage. The next file opens not in the desert, but in a Florida suburb, where manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs hide private battles behind closed doors. It was here in Land O'Lakes that a woman named Samantha Keithley lived with her husband Curtis Reeves, a deputy with the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. To neighbors, they looked like a typical family. They had children, a comfortable home, and the outward appearance of stability. But appearances can be deceptive. Samantha was in her 30s, known for her warmth and devotion to her kids. Friends described her as lively, always present at school events, and willing to lend a hand to neighbors. Yet those closest to her also knew she was carrying tension inside her marriage. Curtis, her husband, wore the uniform of law enforcement, but inside the home he was controlling and volatile. His career gave him authority in the community, but in private, it fueled a sense of entitlement that left Samantha feeling trapped. By the late summer of 2018, cracks in their marriage were widening. Friends noticed the way Samantha's tone shifted when she spoke of him. She confided to a few that arguments had become constant, that he followed her movements and demanded explanations. She felt suffocated. At times she thought about leaving, but leaving a deputy sheriff is not the same as leaving an ordinary spouse. There were fears about custody, finances, and retaliation. For Samantha, the decision was layered with risk. On September 23rd, the tension reached a breaking point. That evening, arguments began in their home. For 6 hours they fought. Curtis accused, shouted, and demanded. Samantha tried to defend herself, texting a friend throughout the ordeal. Those text messages would later become chilling evidence, capturing her fear in real time. She told her friend that the situation was unbearable, that she was terrified of what might happen. She wrote that she did not know if she would make it through the night. Around midnight, the argument reached its peak. In anger, she removed her wedding ring and placed it on the counter. That simple act, discarding a symbol of their marriage, seemed to inflame him further. He paced, shouted, and refused to calm down. The children were in the house, witnesses to the rising storm of their parents' fight. For Samantha, every moment carried the risk that words would turn into something worse. In abusive relationships, separation is often the most dangerous moment. Experts in domestic violence warn that when a partner senses they are losing control, the threat of lethal violence increases dramatically. Samantha was at that threshold. By removing her ring and voicing her intent to leave, she had challenged the authority her husband believed he held over her. And in that fragile window, his rage turned deadly. Shortly after midnight, a shot rang out inside the Keithley home. Their teenage son, Mark, had been outside, driven there by the intensity of the argument. When he heard the sound, he called 911 in panic. His voice on the recording was frantic as he told the dispatcher his mother had been shot. Deputies rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Samantha was dead, killed by the man who had vowed to protect her. Curtis then turned the gun on himself, ending his own life in what investigators described as a murder-suicide. The shock spread quickly through the community. A sheriff's deputy entrusted with authority and charged with protecting the public had murdered his own wife in front of their children. At a press conference, the Pasco County Sheriff called it one of the most devastating cases he had seen, acknowledging the pain felt by colleagues who had worked alongside Curtis for years. For Samantha's family and friends, it was a tragedy that seemed both sudden and inevitable, the grim culmination of warning signs ignored for too long. In the days that followed, attention focused not only on the crime itself, but on the system that had failed to protect her. Advocates pointed out how difficult it is for spouses of law enforcement officers to report abuse. Fear of retaliation, mistrust that complaints will be taken seriously, and the professional standing of the abuser all create barriers. Samantha's case became a rallying point for conversations about how domestic violence can hide even in households tied to law enforcement. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to how deeply she was loved. Friends remembered her laugh, her kindness, her devotion to her children. They spoke about the texts she had sent in her final hours, messages that now read like a desperate prophecy. For many, the hardest truth was knowing that she had seen what was coming and still could not escape it. Behind the flowers and condolences, the real weight of the tragedy lay in the children left behind. They had lost their mother to violence and their father to his own hand, all in the space of minutes. Their lives would be forever divided into before and after that September night. What happened in Land O'Lakes was not just the collapse of a marriage. It was the destruction of a family, the silencing of a woman who had tried to hold on for her children until it was too late. And it was a reminder that danger often hides behind badges and uniforms, concealed by the respect of a community until the truth forces its way out in the most violent of ways. The argument that night did not fade. It stretched across hours, filling every room of the Keithley home with tension. Samantha had texted a close friend, her words short and urgent, as though she was trying to release fear into her phone while still enduring it in real time. She wrote that Curtis was furious, that he would not stop, that she was afraid of what might happen. She admitted she had taken off her wedding ring and thrown it aside, a symbolic gesture that had only pushed his anger further. Each message she sent was a plea and a warning. Domestic violence advocates often say the last hours of a victim's life are written in their texts. Samantha's words carried the hallmarks: exhaustion, fear, hopelessness, a sense that the situation had spun out of control. She told her friend she was scared for her safety, scared for the children, and uncertain if she would see morning. Curtis, a deputy trained in law enforcement, used his authority in the worst way. He patrolled the streets by day enforcing order, but inside his home, he was the threat. His training gave him confidence with weapons. His badge gave him power. That night, he turned all of it against the woman who shared his life. For Samantha, the man who should have been protector had become executioner. The children were in the house as the shouting escalated. Their teenage son, also named Mark, left the building at one point, retreating to the safety of the outdoors. He heard the voices rise, heard his mother cry out, and then he heard the sound no child should ever hear. A gunshot echoed from inside. Panic overwhelmed him. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His voice on the recording carried terror as he told the dispatcher his mother had been shot, that his father had pulled the trigger. Inside, deputies arriving at the scene found the aftermath. Samantha lay dead from a single gunshot wound. Nearby, Curtis had turned the weapon on himself, ending his life with the same finality. In a matter of moments, the home had gone from a place of conflict to a crime scene. The children were suddenly orphans, standing in shock as uniforms from the same sheriff's office that had once employed their father now surrounded the property. The news traveled quickly through the county. A deputy sheriff had killed his wife, then himself. To colleagues, it was almost impossible to reconcile the man they had worked alongside with the murderer they now read about in reports. But for Samantha's friends, the tragedy was less surprising. They knew she had been struggling. They knew she was afraid. Some remembered the way her voice faltered when she mentioned her marriage, the way her smile seemed forced when Curtis was nearby. At a press conference, the sheriff called the case heartbreaking, acknowledging that even those sworn to protect can become abusers behind closed doors. He reminded the public that domestic violence does not discriminate by profession, income, or neighborhood. It can happen in any home. Samantha's death made that truth impossible to ignore. Her text messages from that night became central to the story. Reporters quoted them in headlines. They showed a woman who foresaw what was coming, who put her fear into words hours before her death. One message read like a prophecy: "I don't know if I'm going to make it through this." Friends who received those texts said later they wished they could have done more, but distance and time left them powerless. The reality is that Samantha had been trapped in a system that gave her few safe exits. For her children, the trauma was immediate and lifelong. They were left with the memory of their mother's final hours and the knowledge that their father had destroyed her. Counselors worked with them in the days after, but no therapy can erase the moment a child hears the gun that ends a parent's life. The violence etched itself into their memories, shaping them in ways they will carry forever. The community mourned. Vigils were held. Neighbors left flowers outside the home. At her funeral, speakers remembered Samantha as vibrant, generous, always putting her children first. They spoke about the way she loved, the way she laughed, and the way she never stopped trying to build a safe home despite the fear she lived with. In the end, her efforts were not enough to shield her from a man whose rage outweighed every oath he had sworn as a deputy. The sound of that gunshot ended Samantha's life and Curtis's as well, but it also revealed the devastating truth about what had been happening inside their home. The text she sent the ring, she removed the words she left behind. All of them remain as testimony. They tell us that she saw the danger clearly, that she named it, and that she knew it might kill her. In the end, her warning was fulfilled. On the night of September 23rd, after hours of arguing and tension that filled every corner of the house, the sound of a single gunshot ended Samantha's life. For her teenage son, Mark, the moment is seared into memory. He had stepped outside, overwhelmed by the shouting, seeking a breath of air away from the storm inside. What he heard instead was the crack of a weapon fired at close range, a sound that split the night and told him instantly that something irreversible had happened. His reaction was instinctive. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. On the recording, his voice trembles with fear and disbelief. He told the dispatcher that his father had shot his mother, that she was inside the home, that he did not know if she was alive. His words tumbled over one another, a mix of panic and shock. To hear a child describe such a scene is to understand the depth of trauma in real time. Within minutes, deputies arrived. The flashing lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the house that had become both home and crime scene. They entered cautiously, weapons drawn, uncertain if the situation was still unfolding. What they found was grim. Samantha lay motionless, fatally wounded by the shot that had silenced her. Nearby, Curtis's body was discovered. He had turned the gun on himself, ending his life in an instant after taking hers. The children were pulled outside, shielded from the worst of what was inside. But they already knew. They had heard the fight. They had seen the ring discarded. They had listened to their mother's fear and their father's rage, and now they had lived through the moment it all became final. Counselors would later describe the psychological scars as profound. To witness domestic violence is one trauma. To lose both parents in one violent moment is something beyond words. Neighbors gathered quickly, drawn by the sirens. Some tried to comfort the children, though no comfort could erase what they had lost. Others stood in stunned silence, whispering disbelief that the deputy who had once patrolled their streets was now the man responsible for such destruction. The uniform he had worn no longer symbolized protection. It symbolized betrayal. Inside the home, investigators documented every detail. They photographed the room where Samantha had fallen, collected the weapon, noted the ring she had thrown onto the counter. They downloaded her phone, preserving the final texts she had sent to her friend. Those texts became the timeline of her last hours, evidence that she had foreseen what was coming but could not escape it. They showed her fear, her exhaustion, her desperation. They were the written testimony of a victim moments before her death. The sheriff's office released a statement acknowledging the tragedy. They spoke of Samantha's death as a reminder that domestic violence spares no one, not even those connected to law enforcement. They pledged support for the children left behind and admitted the weight of knowing that one of their own had committed such an act. It was a moment of reckoning, an acknowledgement that badges and training cannot always shield families from the dangers within. For Samantha's children, the days that followed were filled with grief and confusion. One moment they had parents, the next they had funerals. Friends and relatives stepped in, offering support, but nothing could replace what had been taken. Their lives had been divided by a single gunshot into before and after would never be the same. At her funeral, her teenage son spoke briefly, his words halting but strong. He remembered his mother's love, her laughter, the way she cared for them, even when her own life was difficult. He thanked those who came to honor her. His voice shook, but his message was clear. She was not only a victim. She was a mother, a friend, and a woman who had tried to survive in the face of impossible circumstances. The community mourned with them. Vigils were held. Candles were lit. Flowers covered the steps of the home. Reporters covered the story, but for those closest to Samantha, the headlines only scratched the surface of the pain. Behind every article was the reality of children waking up without their mother, grappling with the knowledge that their father had caused it. The 911 call the police reports the funeral. All of it told the story of a family destroyed. It was not just the end of a marriage, it was the violent collapse of an entire household. And for those who loved Samantha, the memory of that night would never fade. It would echo in their minds, a reminder of how quickly arguments can turn deadly when rage and control replace love. The morning after the tragedy, news crews gathered outside the Keithley home. The flashing lights of patrol cars had faded, but the scene was still heavy with silence. Yellow tape marked the boundaries, a stark reminder that what had once been a family's private space was now a place of evidence. Reporters spoke quietly into cameras, struggling to put into words the horror of a deputy sheriff murdering his wife before killing himself. The story spread quickly, not only through Florida, but across the nation. The Pasco County Sheriff stood before microphones, his uniform crisp, his voice grave. He acknowledged the pain felt within the department, admitting that the loss was twofold: the death of a woman who deserved protection and the betrayal by one of their own. He spoke of Samantha as a victim who had slipped through the cracks of awareness, and he did not soften his language when he described Curtis's actions. He called them devastating, a violation of trust, a reminder that domestic violence respects no badge. For the community, the revelation was almost impossible to reconcile. Many had seen Curtis in uniform, patrolling neighborhoods, directing traffic, responding to calls. He was supposed to be the man who restored calm when others faltered. Yet in his own home, he had become the source of chaos, the threat his family could not escape. Parents whispered to each other at school drop-offs, wondering how Samantha had endured, why no one had seen the danger. Neighbors spoke about how kind she had been, how often she smiled, how she never let on about the storm inside her marriage. Media outlets highlighted the text messages she had sent in her final hours, words that captured the essence of fear more vividly than any second-hand account could. Headlines repeated her lines, "I don't know if I'm going to make it through this," transforming her private messages into a public record of desperation. For advocates of domestic violence survivors, the case became proof of how vital it is to listen when someone hints at danger, even indirectly. The sheriff's office organized counseling for its deputies, many of whom had worked alongside Curtis and now wrestled with disbelief. Some officers admitted they felt anger not only at him, but at the system that had allowed the abuse to remain hidden. Others confessed to guilt, wondering if signs had been missed, if there had been moments when Samantha's life could have been saved. In law enforcement culture, where loyalty to colleagues runs deep, confronting the reality of one of their own as a murderer was profoundly unsettling. Local advocates held vigils. Candles flickered in the Florida night as friends and strangers gathered to say Samantha's name, to affirm that she was more than a headline. They spoke about the importance of breaking the silence, of recognizing that domestic abuse thrives in secrecy. Survivors stood and told their stories, reminding the community that leaving is often the most dangerous time, that fear of retaliation keeps many trapped. Samantha's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that repeats in households across the country. Journalists dug deeper into statistics. They reported that women married to law enforcement officers face unique barriers when trying to seek help. Complaints against officers are often filtered through internal departments, creating fear that reports will not be taken seriously. Some victims worry about retaliation from colleagues, about losing financial support, about custody of children. Samantha's death underscored those dangers, forcing a conversation that had been avoided for too long. Her funeral became a community event, attended not only by family and friends, but by strangers who felt compelled to show support. Speakers remembered her laughter, her love for her children, her generosity. They also spoke of the warnings she had given in her texts, the clear signs that she knew her life was in danger. For many, the hardest truth was that even with those warnings, nothing had been done in time to save her. In the weeks that followed, editorials called for reform. Some demanded better support systems for spouses of law enforcement officers. Others urged stricter screening of deputies' behavior at home, recognizing that power can corrupt not only on the street but in private. Legislators discussed funding for domestic violence, shelters, and hotlines. Samantha's story became a catalyst, a reminder that change often comes only after tragedy. For her children, the public attention did little to ease the private grief. They were adjusting to life without their mother, processing trauma that no amount of media coverage could capture. They had lost not only their parents, but their sense of safety. Counselors worked with them, but healing would be slow. The community continued to talk, continued to mourn, and continued to reckon with the fact that trust can be betrayed in the most intimate of spaces. Samantha's case revealed not only the brutality of one man's act, but the fragility of the systems meant to protect. And it left behind a haunting truth: if it could happen in the home of a deputy, it could happen anywhere. The morning after the tragedy, news crews gathered outside the Keithley home. The flashing lights of patrol cars had faded, but the scene was still heavy with silence. Yellow tape marked the boundaries, a stark reminder that what had once been a family's private space was now a place of evidence. Reporters spoke quietly into cameras, struggling to put into words the horror of a deputy sheriff murdering his wife before killing himself. The story spread quickly, not only through Florida but across the nation. The Pasco County Sheriff stood before microphones, his uniform crisp, his voice grave. He acknowledged the pain felt within the department, admitting that the loss was twofold: the death of a woman who deserved protection, and the betrayal by one of their own. He spoke of Samantha as a victim who had slipped through the cracks of awareness, and he did not soften his language when he described Curtis's actions. He called them devastating, a violation of trust, a reminder that domestic violence respects no badge. For the community, the revelation was almost impossible to reconcile. Many had seen Curtis in uniform, patrolling neighborhoods, directing traffic, responding to calls. He was supposed to be the man who restored calm when others faltered. Yet in his own home, he had become the source of chaos, the threat his family could not escape. Parents whispered to each other at school drop-offs, wondering how Samantha had endured, why no one had seen the danger. Neighbors spoke about how kind she had been, how often she smiled, how she never let on about the storm inside her marriage. Media outlets highlighted the text messages she had sent in her final hours, words that captured the essence of fear more vividly than any second-hand account could. Headlines repeated her lines, "I don't know if I'm going to make it through this," transforming her private messages into a public record of desperation. For advocates of domestic violence survivors, the case became proof of how vital it is to listen when someone hints at danger, even indirectly. The sheriff's office organized counseling for its deputies, many of whom had worked alongside Curtis and now wrestled with disbelief. Some officers admitted they felt anger not only at him, but at the system that had allowed the abuse to remain hidden. Others confessed to guilt, wondering if signs had been missed, if there had been moments when Samantha's life could have been saved. In law enforcement culture where loyalty to colleagues runs deep, confronting the reality of one of their own as a murderer was profoundly unsettling. Local advocates held vigils. Candles flickered in the Florida night as friends and strangers gathered to say Samantha's name, to affirm that she was more than a headline. They spoke about the importance of breaking the silence, of recognizing that domestic abuse thrives in secrecy. Survivors stood and told their stories, reminding the community that leaving is often the most dangerous time, that fear of retaliation keeps many trapped. Samantha's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that repeats in households across the country. Journalists dug deeper into statistics. They reported that women married to law enforcement officers face unique barriers when trying to seek help. Complaints against officers are often filtered through internal departments, creating fear that reports will not be taken seriously. Some victims worry about retaliation from colleagues, about losing financial support, about custody of children. Samantha's death underscored those dangers, forcing a conversation that had been avoided for too long. Her funeral became a community event, attended not only by family and friends, but by strangers who felt compelled to show support. Speakers remembered her laughter, her love for her children, her generosity. They also spoke of the warnings she had given in her texts, the clear signs that she knew her life was in danger. For many, the hardest truth was that even with those warnings, nothing had been done in time to save her. In the weeks that followed, editorials called for reform. Some demanded better support systems for spouses of law enforcement officers. Others urged stricter screening of deputies' behavior at home, recognizing that power can corrupt not only on the street but in private. Legislators discussed funding for domestic violence shelters and hotlines. Samantha's story became a catalyst, a reminder that change often comes only after tragedy. For her children, the public attention did little to ease the private grief. They were adjusting to life without their mother, processing trauma that no amount of media coverage could capture. They had lost not only their parents, but their sense of safety. Counselors worked with them, but healing would be slow. The community continued to talk, continued to mourn, and continued to reckon with the fact that trust can be betrayed in the most intimate of spaces. Samantha's case revealed not only the brutality of one man's act, but the fragility of the systems meant to protect. And it left behind a haunting truth: if it could happen in the home of a deputy, it could happen anywhere. Tiendo. Đây là phần 17. Phần tiếp theo theo outline là phần 18 tháng. Lễ của Samantha, sự tiếc thương của bạn bè và cộng đồng, và phân tích thống kê về bạo lực gia đình. Bạn có muốn tôi viết ngay phần 18 không? Bạn đã nói, một chat GPT đã nói. Đây là phần 18 đầy đủ theo outline. Văn bản plain text khoảng 5.000 ký tự, không số, không tiêu đề, không compliance line. The church filled quickly on the morning of Samantha's funeral. Friends arrived in clusters, some holding flowers, others clasping tissues, all wearing expressions that reflected the same disbelief. How could a woman, so full of life, so devoted to her children, be gone in an instant at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her? The air was heavy with grief, but also with the unspoken acknowledgement that many had seen shadows of trouble long before tragedy struck. Her children sat near the front, surrounded by relatives who tried to shelter them from the constant eyes of the crowd. The youngest clutched a stuffed toy, a small anchor in a storm of confusion. Her teenage son, who had made the frantic call to 911, looked older than his years, his face carrying the weight of trauma no child should bear. Every glance at them reminded mourners of the deepest cost. These were the ones who had lost not just a mother, but the foundation of their lives. Speakers remembered Samantha for her warmth. Colleagues from school events talked about her energy, her willingness to step in where needed. Neighbors recalled her kindness, how she welcomed newcomers, how she kept her door open to children in the neighborhood. Friends told stories of laughter, of late-night conversations, of a woman who loved fiercely. Yet woven through every memory was the painful contrast. She had lived with fear and endured control, and in the end the danger she feared became her reality. When the pastor spoke, he emphasized that the tragedy was not a reflection of Samantha's strength, but of the violence she endured. He reminded everyone that victims of abuse often fight battles unseen, and that survival is not as simple as leaving. His words cut through the silence. We must remember her not only as a victim, but as a woman who loved her children until her last breath. Outside the church, television cameras captured the stream of mourners. Journalists framed the story as a shocking fall from trust, focusing on the fact that Samantha's husband had been a deputy. But advocates seized the moment to discuss broader truths. They spoke about statistics in the United States. Nearly 1 in 4 women experience severe physical violence, from an intimate partner. On average, 3 women are killed each day by current or former partners. And experts warn that those married to law enforcement officers face even higher risks, both because of access to weapons and the intimidation of reporting against someone in uniform. Shelter directors gave interviews explaining the barriers. Victims tied to law enforcement often believe no one will believe them. Some fear retaliation. Others worry that complaints will be buried by internal investigations. For Samantha, these dynamics may have shaped her silence. The texts she sent in her final hours proved she understood the danger, but the system around her did not move fast enough to protect her. At the graveside service, friends wept openly. White roses covered the casket, each one placed by someone who had loved her. Her children stood quietly, their hands held tightly by grandparents. The sound of sobbing mixed with the rustle of wind through the trees. It was a scene repeated in countless towns across the country, a family broken by domestic violence, a community mourning what might have been prevented. Afterward, community members gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. Some expressed guilt for not asking harder questions. Others admitted they had seen signs, but did not want to interfere. Many promised to do better, to listen more carefully when friends or neighbors spoke of fear at home. Samantha's death became not only a personal loss, but a collective reckoning. The weeks that followed saw vigils in her honor. Candles flickered at night as people gathered with signs that read "End Domestic Violence," and her name was spoken aloud again and again. Each vigil served as both memorial and warning. Her story became a symbol of the thousands of women silenced each year, a reminder that awareness must be constant, that silence is dangerous, and that intervention can save lives. For her children, however, the statistics meant little. They were left with memories of their mother's laughter, her voice calling them to dinner, her presence at school events. They also carried the memory of that night, the shouting, the texts, the sound of a gun. Counselors worked with them, but grief is not easily healed, and trauma does not vanish with time. They would live with it always. Samantha's funeral closed one chapter, but it opened another. It forced conversations that many would rather avoid about power control and the hidden realities inside households that look normal from the outside. Her life was honored with tears and flowers, but her death demanded more. It demanded change. After the funerals ended and the vigils dimmed, the questions began. How does a marriage that once looked ordinary end in gunfire? How does a deputy sworn to protect become the one who destroys? Advocates and investigators turned to the warning signs that had been visible long before that September night. Samantha's case was not isolated. It was part of a pattern repeated in homes across the country, where control, jealousy, and intimidation slowly escalate until violence becomes inevitable. Experts on domestic abuse describe a cycle. It begins with tension, verbal arguments, accusations, and surveillance of a partner's movements. Then comes an explosion, a moment of violence or threat. Afterward, there is remorse, apologies, promises that it will never happen again. The cycle repeats, each loop wearing down the victim's resistance, each loop increasing the risk. Samantha's texts revealed she was trapped in that cycle. She spoke of arguments that stretched for hours, of her husband's relentless demands, of her exhaustion. Removing her wedding ring was a desperate act of defiance, but also one that placed her in the most dangerous stage separation. Statistical studies show that women are most at risk of being killed when they attempt to leave or signal the end of a relationship. Researchers call these moments lethality indicators. If the abuser has access to firearms, if he has a history of threats, if jealousy is extreme, the risk multiplies. Samantha's situation checked all of these boxes. Her husband was armed, trained in the use of weapons, and consumed by jealousy and control. When she declared she was done, the outcome aligned with what experts fear most, an eruption of lethal violence. Law enforcement officers are not immune to these dynamics. In fact, some advocates argue that the risks are heightened. Officers are trained in control, skilled with weapons, and often insulated by a culture that discourages outside scrutiny. Victims married to officers may hesitate to seek help, fearing that colleagues will protect their own or dismiss allegations. In Samantha's case, this barrier was insurmountable. Her fear was real, her warnings clear, but the system around her offered no safe avenue to escape. Friends recalled subtle signs, the way her smile dimmed when Curtis entered the room, the way she avoided conversations about her marriage, the way she seemed relieved when he was not nearby. These small observations, when viewed in hindsight, were pieces of a larger puzzle. Together, they painted the picture of a woman, under constant pressure, living in the shadow of control. Domestic violence experts stress that these warning signs must be recognized and acted upon. Isolation, surveillance, jealousy, threats, and access to weapons are not private matters to be ignored. They are predictors of danger. They are signals that intervention is necessary. Samantha's story underscored this truth with devastating clarity. In the aftermath, advocates called for more training, both for law enforcement and for the public. They argued that officers should be monitored not only for their conduct on duty, but for their behavior at home. They urged communities to create pathways for spouses of officers to report abuse safely without fear of retaliation. They pushed for legislation that would remove firearms from abusers the moment credible threats were identified. Statistics gave weight to their demands. According to national surveys, nearly 50% of women murdered by intimate partners are killed with guns. The presence of a firearm in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. These numbers were not abstract in Samantha's case. They were her reality. Her husband's access to a gun was the final link in a chain of danger that had been tightening for years. For her children, the analysis provided little comfort. They already knew the outcome, already carried the scars of that night. For the community, however, the discussion became vital. It was a chance to learn to understand that what seems like ordinary arguments may hide deeper threats, to recognize that early intervention can prevent funerals. Samantha's death was a tragedy, but it could also be a lesson. In gatherings across Pasco County, advocates spoke her name while explaining the patterns of coercive control. They reminded listeners that abuse is not always visible bruises. Sometimes it is isolation from friends, constant monitoring of phone calls, accusations about imagined infidelities. These behaviors may appear minor in isolation, but together they form a system of domination. Left unchecked, that system often escalates into violence, and sometimes into murder. Samantha's story became part of a larger narrative, a reminder etched into local memory that silence is dangerous, that signs must be heeded, and that love twisted into control can become lethal. The warning signs were there. The statistics predicted the risk, the outcome proved them true. And now her case stands as both a caution and a call to action, to see, to listen, and to act before another family is shattered by the sound of a single gunshot. In San Diego's Liberty Station, life often looked picture perfect. The converted naval base had become a thriving community of parks, schools, restaurants, and waterfront views. Rows of tidy townhomes lined the streets, families gathered at playgrounds, and joggers traced the paths along the bay. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved, where houses glowed with warm lights at night, and where danger seemed far away. Yet, even in places that look safe, cracks can run deep behind closed doors. Elizabeth Sullivan lived there in 2014. She was 32, married to Matthew Sullivan, a Navy man whose career kept him disciplined on the surface, but rigid at home. They had 2 daughters together, young girls who filled their house with the noise of childhood. To outsiders, the family looked like many others in the neighborhood: a military husband, a wife balancing motherhood, a home built near the water. but the reality inside was fractured. Elizabeth was known among friends as warm and thoughtful, someone who loved her daughters and tried to make the best of difficult circumstances. Yet her marriage had become a source of strain. Matthew was controlling, quick to anger, and often dismissive. The tension between them grew so sharp that by 2014, Elizabeth had begun to consider leaving. She confided in a close friend that she wanted a divorce, that she dreamed of independence for herself and safety for her children. In October of that year, she took steps toward that future. She met with an attorney to discuss her options. She began to explore what life might look like on her own. She had even started seeing another man, a relationship that gave her moments of happiness after years of frustration. For Elizabeth, these choices were signs of hope, of reclaiming control over a life that had slipped into unhappiness. For Matthew, they were perceived as betrayal. On October 13, 2014, Elizabeth vanished. The last confirmed sighting was near her home. She had missed a legal appointment earlier that day, one connected to her plans for divorce. Her phone went silent, her car remained parked, and her daughters were left without their mother. Friends and family raised alarms immediately, knowing she would never abandon her children voluntarily. Police were called, and a missing persons case began. At first, investigators looked at standard possibilities. Had she left voluntarily, overwhelmed by stress? Had she suffered an accident? But those who knew her insisted neither explanation made sense. Elizabeth was devoted to her daughters, tethered to them by love and responsibility. She would not walk away. The suspicion turned quickly toward Matthew. Neighbors described arguments between the couple, shouting matches that carried through the thin walls of their townhouse. Friends recalled Elizabeth's fears about her husband's temper. Investigators learned about the divorce plans and the new relationship, both potential motives for violence. Yet with no body, no weapon, and no physical evidence at that time, the case stalled. For 2 years, Elizabeth was listed as missing. Her photo appeared on posters and in news reports. Family members pleaded for information, organized searches, and hoped for a miracle. Matthew, meanwhile, left San Diego with his daughters, moving across the country to Delaware. To some, it looked like a grieving husband trying to start over. To others, it looked like a man fleeing the shadow of suspicion. In October 2016, the mystery shifted. 2 years after her disappearance, Elizabeth's remains surfaced in the San Diego Bay. A passerby noticed something floating near the shoreline. When authorities responded, they found what they initially believed to be a badly decomposed body. Testing confirmed it was Elizabeth. She had not run away. She had not chosen to disappear. She had been murdered. Investigators now had proof that the case was not abandonment or accident. It was homicide. Yet even with the body recovered, questions lingered. Where had she been for 2 years? What had happened inside that home on the night she vanished? The answers would take time, but suspicion once again turned firmly toward the man who had shared that home. The husband who had moved across the Bly country, the one person with the strongest motive to silence her. The night of October 13, 2014, Elizabeth Sullivan's townhouse at Liberty Station became the stage for a confrontation years in the making. Tension had been building for months. Elizabeth had spoken openly to friends about her unhappiness. She had met with an attorney, begun the process of preparing for divorce, and even started seeing another man. She was moving toward independence, toward a life without the constant weight of her husband's temper. For Matthew, that was unthinkable. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments from the Sullivan home. Shouting was not unusual between them, but on that night it carried a sharper edge. Elizabeth and Matthew clashed over her plans over the marriage that had unraveled beyond repair. In those heated hours, what began as words escalated into violence. Matthew, a Navy man with a history of rigid control, reached for what prosecutors would later describe as the instrument of her death. Evidence presented years afterward suggested she suffered sharp force injuries. The home itself became the scene of the crime. In the struggle, Elizabeth was fatally wounded. The house fell silent, but the damage was irreversible. A mother of 2 young girls lay dead in her own living room. What followed was concealment. Instead of calling for help, instead of facing what he had done, Matthew turned to deception. Prosecutors would later argue that he placed Elizabeth's body in a freezer inside their garage. For 2 years, her remains were hidden, stored away, while he continued his life as though nothing had happened. Freezer concealment explains why her body was not discovered earlier, why decomposition suggested preservation before eventual disposal. At some point, Matthew decided to rid himself of the evidence. In 2016, Elizabeth's body was moved from the freezer and discarded into the waters of San Diego Bay. The currents eventually carried her to the surface, where a passerby discovered her. By then, decomposition obscured many details, but forensic scientists were able to identify injuries consistent with homicide. For Elizabeth's friends, the news was devastating, but not surprising. Many had suspected Matthew from the start. They had seen her fear, heard her frustration, and understood her longing to escape. For her daughters, the truth was unbearable. Their mother had vanished when they were young, leaving them in confusion. Now it was confirmed that she had been murdered, most likely in the home where they had once felt safe. Matthew tried to present himself as a grieving husband, a man who had lost his wife under mysterious circumstances. He moved across the country, raising his daughters in Delaware, hoping perhaps that distance would shield him from suspicion. But investigators were patient. They built the case, slowly piecing together testimony from neighbors, analyzing forensic evidence, and tracing the timeline of her disappearance. The critical evidence remained in the home itself. Years later, when forensic teams re-examined the townhouse, they discovered traces of Elizabeth's blood beneath flooring and on the knife hidden in the attic. These details painted a picture of what had really happened, an argument that turned deadly, followed by desperate efforts to hide the crime. Elizabeth had tried to leave. She had taken the steps so many victims take, seeking legal advice, preparing for independence, reaching out to friends. But leaving is often the most dangerous moment. For her, it was the point at which Matthew's need for control transformed into violence. The silence of that night was broken only by the sounds of concealment, the freezer door closing, the garage door rolling shut, the quiet movements of a man covering up what he had done. To the outside world, Elizabeth had disappeared without explanation. Inside that home, the truth was hidden in cold storage, waiting for discovery. Years later, the case would come to court, where jurors would hear about the fight, the freezer, and the final betrayal of a man who killed the woman he had promised to protect. But on that October night, all that was known was that a vibrant 32-year-old woman devoted to her daughters had been silenced. Her voice was gone, her laughter gone, her future stolen. And for 2 years, her secret lay hidden, while Matthew walked free, carrying on as though the woman he had killed was simply missing. On the morning of October 6th, the still waters of San Diego Bay revealed what had been hidden for 2 years. A passerby walking along the shoreline noticed something caught near the rocks, something that at first glance looked like debris carried in by the tide. But as authorities arrived, it became clear that this was no piece of refuse. It was human remains, badly decomposed, yet intact enough to suggest preservation. The body was recovered and transported to the medical examiner's office. Soon after the confirmation came, the remains belonged to Elizabeth Sullivan. For her family, the news was both devastating and clarifying. The endless uncertainty of the past 2 years ended with a truth they had always feared but never stopped bracing for. Elizabeth had not run away. She had not chosen to leave her daughters. She had been killed hidden and eventually discarded into the water. The hope that she might return was gone, but so too was the torment of not knowing. They could finally grieve with certainty, though grief sharpened by betrayal. The forensic examination was meticulous. Specialists studied the remains, noting that decomposition did not match the timeline of her disappearance. If Elizabeth had died in 2014 and been left in the bay, her body would have surfaced much earlier and her condition would have been far different. Instead, her remains bore characteristics consistent with having been stored in a freezer before being submerged. Freezer burn patterns slowed decomposition, and unusual preservation supported this conclusion. These details became critical in the eventual prosecution. The examination also revealed signs of sharp force trauma. Though decomposition obscured some evidence, injuries consistent with stabbing were identified. These findings aligned with the theory that she had been killed in her home and then concealed. For investigators, the pieces fit a violent confrontation, a desperate act of concealment in the garage freezer, and eventual disposal in the bay when Matthew could no longer keep her hidden. News of the discovery spread quickly. Media outlets reported that the missing Navy wife had finally been found. Reporters revisited interviews with friends who had spoken of Elizabeth's unhappiness, of her plans for divorce, of her desire for a new life. They contrasted those hopes with the grim reality of her death. Headlines emphasized the haunting detail of the freezer theory, a detail that horrified the public and cemented suspicion on Matthew Sullivan. In Delaware, where Matthew had moved with his daughters, the discovery triggered renewed scrutiny. Neighbors who had accepted him as a quiet single father now questioned what he had left behind. Investigators in San Diego reopened their focus on the townhouse, re-examining every inch for evidence missed in earlier searches. What they found in later years would tie the case together: blood beneath flooring, traces linked to Elizabeth, and a knife hidden in the attic. For Elizabeth's daughters, the discovery marked the end of one form of uncertainty and the beginning of another. They now knew their mother was gone, but they were too young to understand the full weight of how and why. Family members tried to shield them, to preserve innocence where possible, but the shadow of violence would follow them always. For the broader community, the case underscored the chilling truth about domestic violence. Here was a woman who had tried to leave, who had taken steps toward independence, and yet was silenced before she could succeed. Here was a mother hidden in her own home, stored in a freezer, and cast into the bay as though her life could be erased. Yet her remains refused silence. They surfaced, carrying testimony in the form of injuries and preservation that told investigators exactly what had been done to her. Elizabeth's body, discovered by chance, became the turning point. It shifted the case from speculation to certainty, from suspicion to prosecution. The bay had given her back, and in doing so had delivered evidence that no denial could erase. Her friends gathered once more, this time to mourn openly rather than to search. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, her devotion to her children. They spoke of her courage in trying to escape, and of the injustice that her efforts ended in death. The discovery confirmed what they had long suspected, but it also reignited anger. For 2 years, Matthew had lived freely, raising their children, while the truth of his crime sat locked in silence. That silence was now broken. And with Elizabeth's return from the bay, investigators had what they needed to move forward. The focus sharpened on Matthew Sullivan, the husband who had claimed ignorance, who had moved away, who now faced the weight of forensic proof. The water had surrendered its secret, and with it, the path to justice had finally begun to open. By the time Matthew Sullivan stood trial in 20 years had passed since Elizabeth's disappearance and the grim discovery of her remains in San Diego Bay. The courtroom was packed with reporters, relatives, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. The prosecution was determined to prove what many had suspected all along, that Elizabeth had been murdered in her own home by the man who had promised to love her, and that he had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide his crime. The evidence they presented was painstakingly detailed. Investigators returned to the Sullivan townhouse, and used advanced forensic tools to examine it once more. What they uncovered told the story Elizabeth herself could not. Beneath sections of flooring, they found traces of her blood invisible to the eye, but revealed through chemical testing. The blood confirmed that violence had taken place inside the home. In the attic hidden away, they found a knife. Experts tested it and matched it to Elizabeth's DNA. Though years had passed, the evidence remained silent but unyielding. The prosecution laid out the sequence for the jury. Elizabeth and Matthew had argued on the night she disappeared. She was planning to leave him, had met with a divorce attorney, and had started seeing another man. That night, Matthew lost control. He stabbed her with the knife, later discovered in the attic. After the killing, he placed her in a freezer in the garage, preserving her body for nearly 2 years before disposing of it in the bay. The forensic evidence, the freezer theory, and the sharp force injuries all aligned with this narrative. Witnesses were called to reinforce the picture. Neighbors testified about the frequent arguments they heard, shouting matches that often left Elizabeth sounding frightened. Friends spoke of her unhappiness, of her repeated mentions of leaving, of her belief that Matthew would not take it well. An attorney confirmed that Elizabeth had missed an appointment related to her divorce plans on the very day she was last seen. These voices brought her closer to life in the courtroom, reminding the jury that she had been a real woman with real hopes, not just a victim. The defense tried to counter. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had witnessed the murder, that Elizabeth's body had been in the bay too long to conclusively prove how she died. They suggested that the prosecution's theory about freezer concealment was speculation. They claimed Matthew was a grieving husband, unfairly targeted. But the physical evidence told another story, one the jury could not ignore. Blood beneath the floor, a knife hidden above the living space. Injuries consistent with stabbing, and a history of marital conflict that made motive clear. The jury listened for weeks, weighing testimony and examining exhibits. They saw photographs of the townhouse, diagrams of where evidence had been found, and reports from forensic scientists. Each piece pointed back to Matthew. Each fragment of evidence chipped away at the narrative of innocence his defense tried to maintain. Elizabeth's family sat through it all, forced to relive her disappearance, her death, and the details of how her body had been concealed. They listened to accounts of freezer storage, of the currents that eventually carried her to the shoreline, of the years they had spent not knowing. Their grief was visible, but so was their resolve. They had waited for this moment, for a chance to hear the truth spoken aloud, and for accountability to be demanded. When closing arguments came, the prosecution left the jury with a stark reminder. Elizabeth did not choose to leave her daughters. She was silenced, she was hidden, and every shred of evidence pointed to the man seated at the defense table. On conviction day, the courtroom was tense. The jury filed back in, and the verdict was read. Matthew Sullivan was found guilty of second-degree murder. For Elizabeth's family, the words were both devastating and relieving. Nothing could bring her back, but finally, the system had named him for what he had done. The conviction underscored the power of forensic evidence. Even after years, even after concealment, the truth had survived in hidden traces in blood, beneath a floorboard, in a knife, tucked away in an attic, in the injuries preserved, despite decomposition. The past could not stay buried forever, and the man who had tried to erase his wife's life could not escape the evidence she left behind. When the jury declared Matthew Sullivan guilty of second-degree murder, the relief in the courtroom was tempered by sorrow. Elizabeth's family had waited 6 long years for justice, yet hearing the verdict did not erase the absence. They still faced birthdays without her milestones, unshared 2 young daughters growing up without their mother. But the conviction meant acknowledgement. It meant the system recognized what had happened behind the closed doors of that San Diego townhouse. The sentencing hearing came in March of 2020. The courtroom was filled again, this time with a different atmosphere. There was no longer uncertainty about guilt. The only question now was how severely Matthew would be punished for stealing Elizabeth's life. Prosecutors asked for the maximum, pointing to the brutality of the act and the years of concealment that followed. They reminded the court that Elizabeth's body had been hidden, frozen, and discarded, that her daughters had lived for years without answers while their father pretended innocence. Family members addressed the court in victim impact statements. Elizabeth's father spoke first, his voice breaking as he described the agony of waiting 2 years for her body to be found. He said that no sentence could measure the pain of losing a daughter in such a way. Elizabeth's friends stood as well, describing her as vibrant, caring, devoted to her children, and betrayed by the man she had once trusted. Each statement underscored the same truth: the crime had not only taken Elizabeth's life, but had scarred everyone who loved her. Matthew sat silently, dressed in jail clothing, listening without visible reaction. His defense team argued for leniency, suggesting that he was not a danger to others, that the conviction itself was punishment enough. But the judge saw the case differently. The evidence had revealed premeditation, concealment, and a callous disregard for both Elizabeth and the daughters left behind. When the sentence was delivered, it was life in prison. Matthew Sullivan would spend the rest of his days behind bars, his freedom gone just as he had stolen Elizabeth's. The courtroom was silent for a moment after the judge spoke, then a quiet sigh of relief swept through the rows where Elizabeth's family Saturday. They knew it did not bring her back, but it ensured that he could never harm another. Outside reporters covered the sentencing with urgency. Headlines declared that justice had finally been delivered for Elizabeth Sullivan, the Navy wife who vanished and whose remains were found in the bay. Commentators highlighted the lessons: how domestic violence often escalates at the moment of separation, how concealment can delay justice but not erase it, and how forensic persistence can finally reveal the truth. For Elizabeth's daughters, the reality was still crushing. They were left with memories too faint to cling to, with years lost to silence, and with the knowledge that their father was now in prison for killing their mother. Relatives stepped in to raise them, providing love and stability, but the absence of both parents would shape them forever. The sentencing marked an end to the legal chapter, but not to the story itself. Advocates used Elizabeth's case as an example when speaking about the need for stronger protections for women trying to leave abusive marriages. They pointed out that Elizabeth had taken the steps many are told to take, consulting an attorney, confiding in friends, yet the danger still claimed her. They urged the public to understand that leaving is not safe without support, and that systems must move faster when signs of violence appear. Elizabeth's funeral had already been held years earlier, but in a way, the sentencing served as a second farewell. Her family could now lay down some of the burden of fighting for justice. They could turn from the courtroom back to remembrance. They could speak about her not only as a victim, but as a woman who loved fiercely, who dreamed of a different life, and who will never be forgotten. For Matthew, the walls of prison became permanent. For Elizabeth, the silence of the bay was broken by truth. And for her daughters, the path ahead would always carry both the shadow of loss and the strength of a community determined to honor their mother's name. By the time Matthew Sullivan was sentenced to life in prison, 3 separate tragedies had unfolded across 2 continents and 1 ocean. Each began in an ordinary setting, with people who dreamed of love, stability, or independence. Each ended in violence, concealment, and grief. Taken together, the stories of Mark Van Dongen in Bristol, Dylan Rounds in Utah, and Elizabeth Sullivan in San Diego reveal not only the brutality of individual acts, but also the patterns of obsession, control, and rage that transform ordinary homes into places of danger. Mark was a young engineer, thoughtful and reserved, who endured years of jealousy until his partner escalated to acid, an act so devastating it stripped him of movement, sight, and ultimately hope. His case revealed how silence can hide abuse, how leaving is often the most dangerous moment, and how legal systems struggle when a victim's death comes through euthanasia after unbearable pain. His story ended with his father at his side, begging doctors for mercy, while his abuser was sentenced not for murder but for grievous harm. The gap between justice and reality lingered, leaving questions that law has yet to fully answer. Dylan was a teenager chasing a dream. In a desert most saw as barren, he saw potential. He planted seeds, drove equipment, and believed he could carve a future from dust. His disappearance in 2022 first looked like misfortune, but the desert's silence soon gave way to evidence. A phone pulled from water boots stained with blood, and a video showing his neighbor Brenner cleaning a gun in the aftermath. For months, his family searched without closure until 2024, when his body was finally recovered from shallow earth and Brenner pleaded guilty. Dylan's story revealed how isolation can hide violence, how vulnerable ambition is when surrounded by men with histories of destruction, and how technology sometimes preserves a victim's testimony when no one else can. Elizabeth was a Navy wife in a California townhouse. She loved her daughters, dreamed of leaving a marriage that had grown cold and controlling, and sought independence with cautious hope. But when she tried to step away, Matthew killed her, hid her body in a freezer, and discarded her in the bay. For 2 years her loved ones searched, clinging to the hope she might return. When her body surfaced, the truth was undeniable. The trial revealed traces of her blood in the home and a knife hidden in the attic. Matthew's conviction brought a measure of justice, but her daughters were left with the lifelong reality that their father had silenced their mother. In each case, the warning signs were visible: jealousy, possessiveness, isolation, access to weapons or dangerous means. Experts call them red flags, but too often they are ignored until it is too late. Mark stayed in hope that kindness could return. Dylan underestimated the threat of neighbors whose pasts were written in violence. Elizabeth believed that by confiding in friends and speaking with an attorney, she could navigate separation safely. Each was overtaken not by accident, but by deliberate acts of cruelty from those who could not bear to lose control. The law responded differently in each case. Berlina Wallace was sentenced to life with a minimum of 12 years, though many felt murder should have been the charge. James Brenner admitted guilt to second-degree murder his sentence, ensuring decades in prison, but never enough to balance a 19-year-old's stolen future. Matthew Sullivan received life behind bars, convicted on evidence his wife's body carried even after years of concealment. In each courtroom, families sat through the recounting of horrors, listened to testimony, and carried grief that no sentence could ease. Beyond the legal outcomes lies the emotional aftermath. Families were shattered, communities shaken, and children left with memories that will never fade. The acid attack in Bristol left neighbors haunted by screams that echoed in the night. The desert in Utah, vast and empty, became a place of mourning rather than ambition. The bay in San Diego, once a scenic backdrop, became the final witness to betrayal. Geography could not soften the truth that violence hides everywhere, in flats, in farms, in townhouses, overlooking water. To listen to these stories together is to trace a single thread woven through 3 lives, the danger of unchecked obsession. Whether expressed through jealousy, rage, or control, the pattern is the same. Victims are silenced, not because they were weak, but because someone else believed possession was more important than love, that control was more important than freedom, that destruction was preferable to loss. These cases leave behind questions more profound than any verdict. How can systems respond faster to warning signs? How can communities intervene before silence becomes fatal? How do we honor victims without reducing them to headlines, remembering their laughter and dreams alongside their final suffering? Mark wanted peace. Dylan wanted crops to grow. Elizabeth wanted freedom and safety for her daughters. Each deserved those futures. Each was denied. And so the stories remain not as isolated tragedies, but as a continuum of violence and loss, urging us to see, to listen, and to act. Because the cost of ignoring the signs is measured not in statistics, but in lives forever cut short. Anger is often the first emotion that rises when the details of these cases are laid bare. It comes in waves sharp and heavy, directed at the perpetrators who turned love and trust into weapons. Berlina's obsession, Brenner's violence, Matthew's control. Each act leaves behind the same bitter question. How could someone who once claimed to care choose such cruelty? The anger extends beyond the perpetrators themselves to the systems that failed to protect. Why was Mark left to suffer years of abuse without intervention? Why was Dylan so exposed in a desert where neighbors with violent histories lived unchecked? Why did Elizabeth's pleas for divorce not trigger greater protection? The rage is justified because each life could have been spared had warning signs been met with action. Beneath anger lies sorrow, a sorrow that spreads far beyond the immediate families. Mark's father sitting helpless by his son's hospital bed, listening to him beg for death. Dylan's parents searching the desert, imagining their boy under the endless Utah sky, waiting for him to return. Elizabeth's daughters growing up with the truth that their father killed their mother, a burden that no child should carry. These images weigh heavy because they are not abstract, they are the lived realities of families broken by violence. The sorrow lingers long after courtrooms close and sentences are handed down. There is also helplessness, the kind that grips communities when violence seems unstoppable. Neighbors who heard Mark's screams that night in Bristol still remember them but could not change the outcome. Search volunteers who combed Lucens's desert scrub felt the futility of looking across miles of emptiness, unable to find the boy they desperately wanted to save. Friends who received Samantha's texts or heard Elizabeth's confessions live with the guilt of not knowing what to do, even though the responsibility was never truly theirs. Helplessness becomes part of the aftermath, an echo of regret that no one can silence. Yet among the anger, sorrow, and helplessness, there is also a demand, a deep craving for justice. It is what kept Mark's father pressing for recognition of his son's suffering, even when the law faltered. It is what drove Dylan's family to return again and again to the desert, demanding answers until the land itself finally gave them. It is what carried Elizabeth's relatives through years of limbo, forcing them to sit in court and listen to every gruesome detail until the jury delivered its verdict. Justice cannot undo what has been done, but it offers structure to the chaos, an acknowledgement that the violence was real, that it mattered, and that the perpetrators will not walk free. Emotions also intertwine, refusing to stay separate. Anger fuels sorrow, sorrow deepens helplessness. Helplessness transforms into the hunger for justice. Together, they form a river that flows through each case, carrying families from shock into mourning, from mourning into advocacy. These feelings do not resolve neatly. They linger, resurfacing when anniversaries arrive, when birthdays pass, uncelebrated when small reminders trigger memory. The human heart is not built to carry such weight without seeking meaning. That is why people gather at vigils, why they light candles, why they speak names aloud even years later. It is why Mark's story is told in discussions of euthanasia and law, why Dylan's is spoken in conversations about rural violence and forensic technology, why Elizabeth's is cited in studies of domestic abuse and the dangers of leaving. The emotions of grief are transformed into tools of memory, ensuring the victims are not erased. Listening to these cases together makes the emotional weight heavier, but also clearer. We see not only individuals, but a pattern: love curdled into obsession, dreams crushed by violence, families left in ruins. The emotions mirror each other across countries and contexts, proving that grief speaks the same language, whether whispered in Bristol, shouted across Utah's desert, or mourned on the shores of San Diego Bay. What remains constant is the sense of unfinished business. No sentence can ever be long enough. No trial can ever fill the empty chairs at family tables. The emotions will always outweigh the outcomes because loss is permanent while justice is limited, and so the feelings remain raw, a living part of each story. But in that rawness, there is also resilience. Families who endure such tragedies learn to carry anger without being consumed by it, to live with sorrow while still moving forward, to acknowledge helplessness but still demand justice. These emotions, painful as they are, become the proof of love. They show that the victims mattered, that their absence is unbearable, and that remembering them is both duty and devotion. Suspense does not always belong to fiction. It lives in the pauses of real cases, in the long gaps where families wait for answers that may never come. Across 3 different tragedies, suspense became the thread that tied together the lives of victims and the anguish of those who loved them. It was not the crafted suspense of novels or films, but the unbearable uncertainty of real time, where every day without resolution deepened fear and despair. For Mark's family, suspense came in the hospital. After the acid seared away his future, he lived suspended between life and death. His father watched monitors, hoping for recovery, yet dreading the pain his son endured. Each surgery carried questions with no answers. Would it ease his suffering or only prolong it? Every moment of his 15-month struggle was heavy with suspense, because the outcome, life in agony or release in death, remained unresolved, until his final plea, indulge him. For Dylan's parents, suspense stretched across desert miles. They drove back and forth to Lucin, stood on the land their son had dreamed of farming, and searched for traces that the desert refused to reveal. Each day brought silence, each lead ended in nothing. Volunteers swept through sagebrush, helicopters circled, dogs sniffed the ground, yet no sign of Dylan appeared. Suspense grew unbearable, because it forced them to live in 2 realities at once. The faint hope he might return, and the dread that he was already gone. Only when his phone revealed the chilling video of Brenner did the suspense shift from where is he to how was he killed, and where was his body hidden. For Elizabeth's friends and family, suspense lasted 2 full years. She had walked out of her townhouse one October day and never returned. Her car sat untouched, her daughters waited, her phone went silent. Each day her loved ones asked the same questions. Did she run? Was she alive somewhere trying to start over, or had something darker happened? Matthew's presence made suspense heavier, because his calm denial and sudden move across the country seemed like answers disguised as silence. The suspense finally broke when her remains surfaced in San Diego Bay, confirming what her friends had long suspected but could not prove. Suspense is not passive, it corrodes. Families in waiting imagine endless scenarios, none of them complete, all of them painful. The mind fills gaps with fear, replaying last conversations, analyzing every word, every sign that might have been missed. Mark's father replayed the moments before the acid attack, wondering if anything could have saved his son. Dylan's parents replayed his last phone call about moving seed from the rain, haunted by its ordinariness. Elizabeth's friends replayed her talk of divorce, seeing now the danger that had been hidden in plain sight. Suspense becomes its own form of torment, a prolonged agony where closure is withheld. In each case, suspense also belonged to the investigations. Detectives faced long stretches with little progress. Evidence was missing, bodies concealed, perpetrators silent. Prosecutors held their breath, uncertain whether cases would collapse under legal loopholes or lack of physical proof. Even when verdicts came, suspense lingered. Would sentences feel sufficient? Would families find peace, or would doubt remain? The suspense in these tragedies does more than build tension. It underscores helplessness. It shows how violence not only destroys lives but delays truth, keeping families locked in uncertainty while perpetrators walk free or sit silent. For Mark, suspense was the hospital corridor where his father waited. For Dylan, it was the desert where his mother shouted his name into wind that carried no answer. For Elizabeth, it was the bay concealing her body while her children asked where she had gone. What unites these stories is the knowledge that suspense could have ended sooner if systems acted faster, if red flags were heeded, if intervention came before the breaking point. Instead, families were left to wait powerless, holding their breath for outcomes they could neither stop nor control. Suspense remains even after verdicts. Families live with lingering questions. What if he had left sooner? What if neighbors had spoken up? What if authorities had done more? These are unanswered questions, loops of uncertainty that replay long after the trials close. That is the cruelest part of suspense in real life. It does not end when the story does. It lingers, shaping memory, shaping grief, reminding survivors every day that there are truths they will never fully know. When three stories converge, the weight becomes almost unbearable. Each one alone is devastating, but together they form a tapestry of violence, silence, and incomplete justice. In Bristol, Mark's life was melted away by acid, his suffering prolonged until he chose release through euthanasia. In Utah, Dylan's body lay hidden under desert soil, while his phone carried the final testimony against the man who ended his dream. In San Diego, Elizabeth's body surfaced in the bay 2 years after she had been silenced, her remains carrying the truth that her husband had tried to erase. Each story ends in death, each in betrayal, by someone close, each with the law struggling to fully match punishment to crime. The crescendo of these cases is not found in a single act of violence, but in the accumulation of failures. Systems meant to protect often intervened too late. Friends saw scratches on Mark's arms but could not save him. Deputies knew of Brenner's record but allowed him to live armed in isolation near a teenager. Elizabeth told friends she wanted to leave, even consulted an attorney, yet her husband still had space to kill and conceal her. These failures become the chorus of the climax, echoing across borders and years. What heightens the sense of climax is the imbalance between horror and consequence. Berlina, who deliberately poured acid onto her partner as he slept, received a minimum of 12 years before parole eligibility. James Brenner, who ended the life of a 19-year-old and buried him, may serve decades, but not the life stolen. Matthew Sullivan, who stabbed his wife and hid her in a freezer, received life imprisonment. Yet his daughters still live with the contradiction that their father was both protector and killer. None of these sentences feel equal to the acts. Justice is written in statutes and years, but grief is measured in screams and desert winds, in the silence of children growing up without their mother. At this point in the narrative, emotions are not separate. Anger merges with sorrow. Suspense collapses into helplessness, and justice, when delivered, feels hollow. The audience listening feels the crescendo not as resolution, but as pressure, a tightening of the chest that reflects the experience of the families themselves. Every courtroom verdict is followed by the same quiet realization: nothing changes the empty chair at the dinner table. The climax also reveals the universality of danger. These tragedies happened in different places: an English city, an American desert, a California suburb. Yet the patterns repeat: control, possession, rage at the thought of losing power, access to means of violence. Each story proves that geography cannot shield anyone from the dangers of obsession. The settings change, but the dynamics remain constant. The helplessness at this peak is profound. No one can intervene in the past. No one can take back. The acid poured the trigger, pulled the knife driven. The families have already endured the worst. What remains is a recognition that their losses must stand as warnings for others. That is why their stories are told not only as tragedies, but as lessons. They remind listeners that silence in the face of warning signs is complicity, that ignoring patterns of control and violence leads to funerals, that justice often arrives too late. The climax is not cinematic. There is no swelling music, no dramatic finale. It is the quiet devastation of 3 families left to carry grief and of communities forced to admit that violence hides everywhere. It is the culmination of 15 months of agony for Mark, 2 years of uncertainty for Elizabeth's loved ones, and endless searches across Utah for Dylan's parents. It is the sound of screams in Bristol, the silence of desert wind, and the tide that gave back a body. At this point, the listener is not only hearing about crime, they are carrying its weight. The suspense has built into an emotional storm where helplessness meets outrage, where justice feels inadequate, and where the victim's absence is felt as keenly as their presence once was. This is the crescendo of true crime, not in fiction, but in lived reality, an unfinished climax that cannot resolve because the lives it shattered cannot be restored. The rain outside has grown steady now, falling in a rhythm that softens the silence. It is the sound of endings and of continuance, a reminder that while storms pass, their mark remains. Tonight we have walked through 3 stories: Mark in Bristol, Dylan in Utah, Elizabeth in San Diego. 3 names, 3 lives, 3 families whose worlds were torn apart by violence that should never have happened. Each story has carried us through shock, through anger, through sorrow, and through suspense, until now we arrive at reflection. Catharsis does not erase pain. It does not bring back the dead or mend the lives left broken. What it offers is release, a chance to breathe. After holding so much weight, a chance to acknowledge that grief can be carried together. To listen to these stories is to take part in that burden, to refuse the silence that perpetrators hoped would prevail. By remembering, by speaking their names, we keep them from vanishing a second time. Mark Van Dongen was more than a victim of an acid attack. He was a son, an engineer, a man who longed for kindness. His final months revealed both the cruelty he endured and the strength he carried, even when he could speak only with the movement of his tongue. Dylan Rounds was more than a missing farmer. He was 19, full of stubborn determination, planting seeds in a desert where others saw only emptiness. His dream was not naive, it was courageous. Elizabeth Sullivan was more than a headline about a Navy wife. She was a mother who loved her daughters, who wanted safety and freedom, who tried to reclaim her life. Their identities matter, their humanity matters. They are not only cases, they are people whose laughter once filled rooms. As listeners, we are left with questions. How do we honor them? How do we change the systems that failed them? How do we prevent another father from hearing his son beg for release? Another mother from walking the desert, calling her child's name? Another daughter from growing up, knowing her father killed her mother? There are no easy answers, but there are truths we cannot ignore. Abuse thrives in silence. Control grows in shadows. Obsession hides in plain sight. Intervention matters. Listening matters. Believing matters. Catharsis also comes from solidarity. When families gather at vigils, when neighbors light candles, when strangers repeat the names of victims, they are saying to the world, you will not be forgotten. That collective act turns private grief into shared memory. It tells survivors that they are not alone, and it tells perpetrators that the silence they tried to impose has been broken. As the rain falls, let yourself feel compassion not only for the victims we have spoken of tonight, but for all who live in fear within their own homes, for all who chase dreams in places that leave them vulnerable, for all who wonder if anyone would listen if they spoke their truth. Compassion is not weakness, it is the bridge between their suffering and our responsibility. We end here not with resolution, but with remembrance. Mark, Dylan, Elizabeth, their lives deserve to be remembered, not for how they ended, but for who they were. The engineer who wanted peace, the young farmer who wanted fields to grow, the mother who wanted safety for her daughters. Each name carries weight. Each story leaves a mark. And as you lie in the quiet now, listening to the rain, remember this final truth: another file waits, another story is out there. But tonight, leave a light on for them, for Mark, For Dylan, for Elizabeth, and for every victim whose voice was taken. Because remembering is the first step to ensuring silence does not win again.